Some expeditions end with heroes returning home. Others end with bodies recovered and lessons learned. But the most haunting expeditions are those where everyone simply vanishes, leaving behind only questions that echo through history. This is the story of 21 expeditions where no one survived to tell the tale. From ancient armies swallowed by desert sands to modern explorers lost in polar ice, these are the journeys that ended in complete disappearance. Each expedition began with hope, preparation, and dreams of discovery. Each ended in mystery. Lost army of campuses. The desert wind carries secrets across the sands of western Egypt. In November 2009, 2 Italian archaeologists stood in the vast emptiness of the Sahara, staring down at what their metal detector had just revealed. Half buried beneath centuries of sand lay bronze arrow tips, fragments of ancient weapons, and something that made their hearts race. A silver bracelet that hadn't seen sunlight for over 2,000 years. Angelo and Alfredo Castiglione, twin brothers who had spent 13 years searching this desolate wilderness, knew they might be looking at the first real evidence of one of history's greatest mysteries. Scattered human bones stretched across the desert floor. Bronze daggers emerged from the sand. Everything pointed to the same impossible conclusion. They had found traces of 50,000 Persian warriors who had vanished without trace in 524 BC. The Castiglione brothers weren't the first to search for this phantom army. For over a century, archaeologists had combed the Egyptian desert, looking for any sign of what historians call the lost army of Cambs. Every expedition had returned empty-handed. The story seemed too fantastic to be true, dismissed by many as ancient propaganda rather than historical fact. But here in the sand 2,500 years later, the evidence was undeniable. This wasn't just any missing army. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, these 50,000 soldiers represented one of the largest military disasters in ancient history. They had marched into the western desert with bronze weapons, provisions, and the confidence of the mighty Persian Empire behind them. None of them ever returned. To understand how such a catastrophe occurred, we must travel back to 525 BC when the Persian Empire stood at the height of its power. Cambyses Tuku, son of the great Cyrus, had just conquered Egypt in a swift and brutal campaign. His armies had crushed Pharaoh Psamek III at the Battle of Pissium, seized the ancient capital of Memphis, and established Persian rule over the land of the Nile. But conquest was only the beginning. Cambyses needed legitimacy. In the ancient world, divine approval mattered as much as military victory. The new Persian pharaoh sent envoys to the oracle of Ammon at Siwa Oasis, one of the most powerful religious sites in Egypt. The priests there held the authority to confirm or deny his claim to rule. The answer that came back from Siwa was not what Cambyses expected. The priests refused to legitimize his reign. They would not bend the knee to this foreign conqueror who had destroyed their pharaoh and occupied their sacred land. For a king who saw himself as chosen by the gods, this rejection was more than an insult. It was a direct challenge to his divine authority. Cambyses decided that if the oracle of Ammon would not bless his rule, then the oracle of Ammon would cease to exist. From his base at Thebes, the ancient Egyptian capital, now known as Luxor, he began planning a punitive expedition that would teach the priest the cost of defying Persian power. The logistics were staggering. The army would have to cross over 500 km of some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The western desert of Egypt stretches endlessly in every direction, a landscape so barren that even the Bedouins called it the land of fear. Water sources are scattered and unreliable. Temperatures during the day can exceed 120 degrees F, while nights bring bone-chilling cold. 50,000 soldiers would need thousands of tons of water for the journey. They would require pack animals, supplies, weapons, and enough food to sustain them for weeks in the wilderness. The scale of the operation demanded meticulous planning and flawless execution. There was no margin for error in a place where a single mistake could doom the entire force. Yet Camby's pressed ahead. Perhaps his anger at the priest clouded his judgment. Perhaps he underestimated the challenges of desert warfare. Or perhaps the Persian king simply believed that his divine favor would protect his soldiers from the harsh realities of the Sahara. The army departed Thebes in 524 BC following a route that historians have debated for centuries. Traditional accounts suggested they traveled northwest through the chain of oases Kar, Dhaka and Farafrai before turning towards Siwa. But the Castiglione brothers proposed a different path based on their archaeological discoveries. They believed the Persians took a more direct westerly route, one that avoided Egyptian-controlled oases where they might face resistance. For 7 days, the massive column marched across the sand. Herodotus records that they reached an oasis, probably El Karaga, where they rested and resupplied. Local sources reported seeing the army depart, moving steadily westward toward their target. It was the last time anyone would see them alive. What happened next has puzzled historians for over 2 millennia. According to Herodotus, the army had traveled roughly halfway to their destination when disaster struck. The soldiers had stopped for their midday meal when the wind began to change. From the south came a hot, powerful gust that grew stronger by the minute. Soon, the air filled with stinging sand that blocked out the sun and turned day into night. The ancient historian described what followed in stark terms. A wind arose from the south, strong and deadly, bringing with it vast columns of whirling sand, which entirely covered up the troops and caused them wholly to disappear. When the storm finally passed, the desert was silent. 50,000 Persian warriors had simply vanished, swallowed by the sand without leaving so much as a footprint behind. No survivors stumbled back to Persian lines. No messenger brought word of the disaster to Cambs. The army had walked into eternity, erased from history as completely as if they had never existed. Back in the present day, the Castilian expedition continued to uncover tantalizing clues. Near the natural rock shelter where they found the bronze weapons, the brothers discovered more artifacts scattered across the desert floor. An ancient earring, silver spheres that might have been part of a necklace, pottery fragments that carbon dating placed at exactly the right time period. Most haunting of all was a mass grave the team located based on stories told by local Bedouins. For decades, the nomads had spoken of thousands of white bones that occasionally emerged from the sand during severe windstorms. When the archaeologists investigated, they found exactly what the stories described: hundreds of bleached human remains scattered across a depression in the desert floor. Among the bones lay Persian arrowheads and a horse bit identical to those depicted in ancient Persian art. The location was roughly 60 mi south of Siwa, precisely where the alternative route proposed by the Castiglione brothers would have brought the army close to their target. The evidence was compelling but not conclusive. Egyptian authorities examined the artifacts and remains but made no official pronouncement about their significance. The discovery created excitement in archaeological circles, but definitive proof remained elusive. The desert had revealed tantalizing hints of the lost army's fate, but the full story remained buried beneath the sand. Modern science offers some perspective on whether a sandstorm could actually destroy an entire army. The Egyptian Western Desert experiences severe weather phenomena that can indeed bury large objects quickly and completely. The camps in winds that blow from the south are notorious for their violence and unpredictability. Temperatures can shift by 40 degrees in minutes, and visibility can drop to 0 in seconds. Military historians point out that ancient armies were particularly vulnerable to such conditions. Without modern communication equipment or weather forecasting, commanders had no warning of approaching storms. Units scattered across miles of desert could become hopelessly separated in minutes. Soldiers weighted down with bronze armor, and weapons would struggle to move quickly through deep sand and Hurak force winds. Percy Fawcett Expedition. The message arrived at the Brazilian telegraph office on a hot afternoon in early June 1925, carried by an unknown native runner through hundreds of miles of harsh jungle. The letter was written in the careful hand of Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett. It was addressed to his wife, Nana, who waited anxiously in England, and it would later become the final word from one of history's boldest expeditions. "You need have no fear of any failure," the letter read. Sent from a place called Dead Horse Camp, the words echoed confidence, though they would later haunt his family. Within days of that message, Foray, his son Jack, and Jack's best friend, Raleigh Rammel, disappeared without a trace deep inside the Amazon basin. The expedition had begun months earlier in the smoky drawing rooms of London's financial district. A secret group of investors known as the Glove had agreed to pay for what Fawcett called his quest for Z, a search for a lost city hidden somewhere in Brazil's remote Mato Grosso region. Fawcett was not an ordinary treasure hunter. At 57, he was over 6 ft tall, with bright, determined blue eyes. The Royal Geographical Society had honored him with their gold medal for his earlier explorations in the Amazon. A decorated artillery officer in World War I, he had won the Distinguished Service Order and earned 3 mentions in dispatches. Even Arthur Conan Doyle was inspired by Fawcett's jungle reports when writing The Lost World. By 1925, however, many in the scientific world dismissed his ideas about ancient civilizations in the Amazon. Modern archaeologists argued that the jungle's poor soil and harsh climate could never support large settlements. Fawcett's finds of pottery shards and ruins were called mere dreams by his peers in London. Still determined to prove his critics wrong, Fawcett spent years searching for financial backing. American newspapers and scientific groups agreed to fund his trip if he sent them exclusive reports from the jungle. Soon, headlines like 3 men face cannibals in relic quest began to appear around the world. Fawcett chose his team with care. His son Jack was 21, lean and strong, with a lively face and a neat mustache that made him look like a Hollywood star. A future he hoped to shape with fame from their discovery. Raleigh Rammel, the son of a British naval surgeon, was 22, tall and robust, with a playful spirit that balanced Fawcett's strict nature. Fawcett had declared to his sponsors that both men were virgin in mind and body and had the strength and will needed to face the trials ahead. On April 20th, 1925, the 3 Englishmen left Guaba, the edge of civilization in Brazil's vast interior. They were joined by 2 Brazilian helpers, 8 mules, 2 horses, a pair of dogs, and enough supplies to last for months. Their goal was to cross over 500 meters of unknown territory where no white man had ever stepped. From the start, Fawcett pushed a hard pace through the charade, a dry forest marking the border of settled lands and true wilderness. He always led the group, hacking at thick brush with an 18-in machete while searching rock faces for ancient carvings. Jack and Raleigh struggled to match his endless energy. Days passed with little to note. The land was mostly a rolling grassland interspersed with twisted trees, dotted with a few sites where people had built small farms. Even in this milder area, the heat was heavy. Fawcett once described fish in the Quaba River as being literally cooked alive. Each evening, the party set up camp, wrapped themselves in mosquito nets and sipped tea, while Fawcett wrote letters to his wife or reports for the newspapers. These messages had to travel by native runners over dangerous long distances and often took weeks or months to reach the world beyond. One day, near the Manso River, Fawcett's pace caused Jack and Raleigh to lose sight of him. Daddy had gone ahead so fast that we lost him completely. Jack later wrote to his mother, describing a frightening night spent alone in the forest until Fawcett reappeared the next morning, riding his horse as if nothing had happened. Crisis struck when Raleigh was bitten by a tick. His foot swelled so badly he could no longer wear his boot. Fawcett then took the group to a cattle ranch owned by Hermina Gildo Galvio, a ruthless landowner controlling much of the Matau Grau. At the red brick manor of this feud-like estate, Galvao later recalled that Fawcett showed him a mysterious stone idol wrapped in cloth. When unwrapped, it revealed a tenon figure with almond-shaped eyes and strange carvings on its chest. Fawcett believed the idol was proof of the lost city Z. After Raleigh recovered, the explorers moved on toward bay known as the last point of civilization. The journey grew tougher as they crossed steep gorges and fast rapids where piranhas circled eagerly. They also had to be wary of the canderu fish, a hidden danger in the water. At Bairi Post, Fawcett was shocked by what he saw. The Brazilian government's attempt to civilize the local Baki tribe had left the people in misery. The BKY have been dying out ever since they became civilized, he wrote to his American sponsors. The few remaining Indians worked on crops without fair pay, living in poor conditions. Despite the sad scene, Jack and Raleigh were excited by the close encounter with the indigenous people. Jack described the visit in a letter to his mother, noting that the locals, armed with long bows and arrows, were fascinating to him. That night, around a campfire, Fawcett played his ukulele, and Jack joined on the piccolo, filling the air with an impromptu concert. On May 19th at Bairi Post, Jack celebrated his 22nd birthday. "I have never felt so well," he wrote, full of excitement for the unknown country that lay ahead, a land completely unexplored. The trio then pushed into deep wild jungle, leaving behind all hopes of outside help. The forest closed in around them, a living tomb full of snapping branches and creeping vines. Swarms of biting insects left painful marks, and even Fawcett confessed in a letter that the heat and harshness were taking their toll. 9 days later, they reached Dead Horse Camp, named after the pack animal Fawcett had once been forced to shoot. White bones of the animal lay scattered, a grim sign of the jungle's unforgiving nature. Worse still, swarms of tiny flies, which Fawcett called the wickedest on earth, filled the air. At Dead Horse Camp, Fawcett made the fateful decision to send the Brazilian helpers back to civilization with most of the pack animals. From then on, the 3 Englishmen would travel on foot, carrying all their supplies. Fawcett believed that a smaller group would attract less attention in the dense jungle. Raleigh's foot was still badly swollen and his wound was infected, but he refused to leave Fawcett's side. Against his better judgment, Fawcett allowed him to continue. On May 29, 1925, Fawcett carefully gathered his final letters and dispatches, sending them ahead with the returning Brazilians. In his dispatch to the North American newspaper Alliance, he wrote, "By the time this dispatch is printed, we shall have long since disappeared into the unknown." In his private letter to Nina, he detailed the hardships and even expressed worry over Raleigh's condition. Yet he ended with the famous words, "You need have no fear of any failure." The 3 men then pressed east into areas no outsider had ever seen. Despite warnings from the local Bay hostile tribes would kill any intruders, Foray brushed aside these cautions with confidence, relying on decades of experience facing the dangers of the Amazon. For 5 days after leaving Dead Horse Camp, a thin trail of smoke from their campfire was visible above the jungle canopy, a sign that they were still alive. But on the 5th day, the smoke vanished. When a search party from the local tribe later looked for them, no trace of Fawcett or his companions was found. The silence that followed turned into one of exploration's greatest mysteries. Had the 3 men been taken by hostile tribes, fallen to illness or hunger, or had they found their lost city Z-papers around the world printed desperate headlines like "Fawcett Party Believed Lost"? Nina Fawcett clung to hope, believing that her husband's experience would bring him safely back with proof of his discovery. But as months turned to years without any news, even the most hopeful began to accept that Fawcett, Jack and Raleigh had been lost to the jungle's vast green maze. In January 1927, nearly 2 years after that final message, the Royal Geographical Society officially declared their disappearance. The celebrated explorer had become another victim of the wild, a mystery that spurred more searches and wild stories about lost men in an endless green wilderness. Even today, the words, "You need have no fear of any failure," remain a testament to the man who chased a dream into the deepest parts of the jungle, a final echo of a determined spirit that may have found something extraordinary in a world few have ever seen. John Catt's final expedition. The document that arrived at Henry VII's court bore a warning that would echo through history. A Bristol merchant named William Weston had written to the king in early 1498 his letter filled with concerns about John Catt's ambitious plans for a second voyage to the New World. Weston knew the Atlantic's moods better than most. He had sailed those dangerous waters and understood how quickly fortunes could change when faced with ocean storms and uncharted coastlines. His words carried the weight of hard experience, but they fell on ears already enchanted by tales of Asian riches just beyond the horizon. Catt had returned from his first voyage in August 1497 as England's Northern Columbus, parading through Bristol's streets dressed in silk, while crowds followed him like he was royalty. Henry VIII had rewarded him handsomely, $10 for finding the new isle, and a pension of 20 yearly, lavish sums when houses rented for $2 per year. The explorer's confidence was infectious. He spoke of vast lands filled with timber, seas teeming with cod, and most importantly, a clear route to the spice markets of Asia. What he'd found, he insisted, was the northeastern coast of the Orient itself. But experienced mariners in Bristol's taverns shook their heads at such certainty. They had seen too many bold expeditions swallowed by the Atlantic to share Catt's optimism. The old hands knew the difference between finding land and finding fortune. Thomas Frobisher, a veteran of Iceland voyages, warned anyone who would listen that the waters west of Greenland were unlike anything in European experience. Ice moved differently there, he said. Storms came without warning. Ships that seemed sturdy in the English Channel could be crushed like eggshells in those distant seas. The concerns weren't limited to weather and navigation. Bristol's merchants, while publicly supportive of the venture, privately expressed doubts about the expedition's financing and organization. Hugh Elliot, one of the investors, had noted troubling signs in Catt's preparations. The explorer's estimates for provisions seemed optimistic. His maps were based more on theory than practical knowledge, and his understanding of ocean currents appeared dangerously incomplete. 5 ships seemed like an impressive fleet. But Elliot wondered if Cabot truly understood what he was asking those vessels to endure. Even brother Giovanni Antonio de Carbonurius, the Milan diplomat whose financial backing made the expedition possible, had expressed reservations. In letters to contacts in Venice, he worried about Catt's tendency to see what he wanted to see rather than what was actually there. The first voyage had found trees and fish, not the golden cities of Cath. Yet Catt spoke as if Marco Polo's Japan lay just beyond the next headland, requiring only determination to reach. The warnings took on a more urgent tone as departure approached. John Day, another Bristol merchant with Atlantic experience, tried to counsel caution. He reminded Cater that Christopher Columbus, despite 4 voyages, had still not found the wealth he had promised. The Spanish explorer's latest report spoke of hardships, hostile natives, and landscapes that bore no resemblance to the rich Orient described in travelers' tales. Why should the northern route prove any different? Religious omens also troubled the expedition's critics. Father Richard Fox, Bishop of Durham, noted that Cabot's planned departure date fell during a period traditionally considered unlucky for sea voyages. The church calendar warned against beginning important ventures when certain stars were in ascendancy. While such concerns might seem superstitious to modern minds, 15th-century sailors took celestial warnings seriously, believing that heaven itself could signal disapproval of earthly plans. The physical signs proved equally troubling. During final preparations in Bristol Harbour, one of Cat's 5 ships developed mysterious leaks that ship struggled to seal. The vessel's timber, which had seemed sound during initial inspection, began showing signs of strain under the weight of provisions and equipment. Master carpenter William Thorne declared the ship seaworthy, but only after extensive repairs that delayed the expedition's departure. Weather patterns also seemed to conspire against the venture. The winter of 1497 to 1498 had been unusually harsh, with storms that battered the English coast well into spring. Experienced mariners read these conditions as warnings of what lay ahead in Atlantic waters. Robert Anderson, master of a vessel that traded with Iceland, predicted that such severe weather patterns would persist through these summer months, making ocean crossings particularly hazardous. Yet despite these accumulating warnings, the expedition departed Bristol in May 1498, with all the fanfare befitting England's most ambitious voyage of discovery. 5 ships carrying approximately 300 men sailed west into waters that had already claimed countless vessels. Cat stood proudly on his flagship's deck, wearing the scarlet robe Henry Zebeth had given him, confident that this voyage would secure his place among history's greatest explorers. The crowds that gathered to watch the departure saw an inspiring sight: vessels loaded with a year's worth of provisions, their holds packed with trade goods meant for Asian markets, their crews filled with England's most experienced mariners. Church bells rang across Bristol as the ships cleared the harbour, their sails full of favourable wind. It seemed like divine blessing on England's boldest enterprise. Within days, however, the first warning proved prophetic. A severe storm damaged one of the 5 vessels, forcing it to seek shelter in Irish waters. The ship limped back to port with reports of tremendous seas and winds that had tested the fleet's structural limits. The crew that returned spoke of mountainous waves and conditions unlike anything they had experienced in European waters. The remaining 4 ships continued westward, disappearing into the vast Atlantic with their dreams of Oriental wealth. No reliable record exists of their fate. Some accounts suggest they reached the North American coast and explored it extensively before attempting the return journey. Others propose that storms claimed the entire expedition somewhere in the trackless ocean between Europe and the New World. By 1500, when no word had arrived from Cat's fleet, the explorer was presumed dead, along with his 300 companions. The warnings that had been ignored before departure now seemed like prophecies of doom. Every concern raised by experienced mariners had apparently manifested in the worst possible way. The price of discovery had proven higher than anyone imagined. Bristol's merchants mourned both the financial losses and the human cost. The families of crew members waited in vain for news that would never come. Henry's investment in northern exploration had vanished into the same void that had swallowed the ships and men. Years later, when other expeditions finally mapped the North American coast that Cabot had sought to explore, the warnings given before his departure proved grimly accurate. The route to Asia was not a matter of sailing west for a few thousand miles. The continent that blocked the way was vast beyond imagination, its waters filled with exactly the hazards that Bristol's veteran mariners had predicted. Court Royal expeditions, the ice held them both. Somewhere in the freezing waters of Newfoundland, 2 Portuguese brothers had vanished into the white silence of the North Atlantic. Gaspar in 1501, Miguel in 1502, 2 separate expeditions 1 year apart, both searching for the same impossible dream. Both brothers swallowed by the same merciless Arctic waters that would claim explorers for centuries to come. It was September 1501 when Gaspar Court Royal's ship disappeared. He had been leading a 3-vessel expedition along the coast of what we now call Labrador, mapping the shoreline, capturing indigenous people to bring back as slaves. 2 of his ships returned to Lisbon in October. His did not. The younger court-rail brother had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and the terrible certainty that something had gone catastrophically wrong. But how did two experienced Portuguese navigators, backed by royal charters and equipped with the finest ships of their time, meet such a fate? The answer lies not in the moment of their disappearance, but in the decisions that led them into those deadly waters in the first place. The Court-Royal family had exploration in their blood. Their father, Zoas Cortal, had sailed these northern routes decades earlier. When King Manuel of Portugal issued royal patents for new voyages of discovery, the brothers saw opportunity where others saw only risk. In 1500, Gaspar had already made one successful voyage to these northern waters, reaching what he called Terra Verde, the Greenland we know as Greenland. He had returned with promising reports of new territories and potential wealth. The king's charter granted the Court-Royal brothers sweeping powers. Any lands they discovered would belong to them in perpetuity. Any profits from fishing, trading, or slavery would flow directly into their coffers. It was an offer that promised immense wealth, but it came with a terrible price. They had to find these lands first, and they had to survive the journey. Gaspar's fatal decision came in the spring of 1501. Fresh from his earlier success, he assembled 3 ships and set sail from Lisbon, determined to establish permanent Portuguese settlements in the New World. His plan was ambitious: explore further south than his previous voyage, establish contact with local populations, and map the coastline for future expeditions. What he didn't account for was how quickly the Arctic could turn deadly. The expedition reached the coast of Labrador in late summer. For weeks the 3 ships sailed together, exploring inlets and harbours. Gaspar made detailed notes of the landscape and the people they encountered. The indigenous inhabitants, likely beer people, initially traded with the Portuguese, but Gaspar had darker intentions. Following the brutal colonial practices of the time, his men began capturing people to bring back to Portugal as slaves. In September, Gaspar made his final fatal choice. While his 2 companion ships prepared for the return journey to Lisbon, loaded with their human cargo and reports of the new lands, Gaspar decided to continue exploring. He wanted to sail further south to map more coastline to find the passage to Asia that every explorer dreamed of discovering. He took his ship and crew into the unknown waters off Newfoundland. Neither he nor any of his men were ever seen again. The 2 surviving ships waited as long as they dared, but with winter approaching and supplies running low, they had no choice but to return to Portugal. They carried devastating news. Gaspar Cotto Royal, royal patent holder and experienced navigator, had vanished somewhere in the North Atlantic. The king had lost not just an explorer, but a substantial investment in ships, supplies, and men. Miguel Cotrial received the news of his brother's disappearance in Lisbon that October. The older brother faced an impossible choice. Gaspar's royal patent now transferred to him along with all the rights and potential wealth it represented, but claiming that inheritance meant returning to the same waters that had swallowed his brother. Miguel's decision came in early 1502. He would organize a rescue mission, 3 ships carefully provisioned and equipped with the latest navigation tools. His official mission was exploration and trade, but everyone understood the real purpose: to find Gaspar Court-Royal, dead or alive. The expedition departed Lisbon in May 1502. Miguel followed the same route his brother had taken the year before, reaching the Newfoundland coast in early summer. For months, they searched the coastline, looking for any sign of Gaspar's ship or crew. They found nothing. No wreckage, no survivors, no trace of what had happened to the missing expedition. As autumn approached, Miguel faced the same deadly choice that had claimed his brother. The sensible decision would be to return to Portugal with what information they had gathered. But Miguel was driven by something beyond mere exploration: the desperate need to discover his brother's fate. In September 1502, exactly 1 year after, Gaspar's disappearance, Miguel made the same fatal decision. He would continue searching while his other ships returned home, the pattern repeated with chilling precision. 2 of Miguel's ships returned to Lisbon, carrying reports and a few indigenous captives. The 3rd ship with Miguel aboard simply vanished. Another Court Royale brother had been swallowed by the North Atlantic, leaving behind the same terrible silence. King Manuel thus now faced the loss of 2 valuable explorers and a significant investment in ships and men. The youngest brother, Vascoanes Cotal, petitioned the king for permission to organize a 3rd expedition to search for his missing brothers. But Manuel had seen enough. In 1503 he banned any further expeditions by the Court Royale family. The cost in lives and resources had become too great. The brothers' fate remains one of exploration's greatest mysteries. No wreckage was ever found. No survivors ever returned to tell their story. Modern historians speculate about what might have happened: ships crushed in ice floes, crews lost to scurvy, vessels wrecked on hidden reefs, or simply overwhelmed by the brutal North Atlantic storms that can sink the largest ships without warning. What makes the court rail disappearances particularly haunting is how the brothers repeated each other's fatal decisions. Both had successful earlier voyages. Both were experienced navigators who understood Arctic conditions. Both chose to continue exploring when prudence demanded retreat. Both vanished at the same time of year, in the same treacherous waters, making the same choice to push beyond the point of no return. Franklin's lost expedition. April 1848, Terror and Erebus had been deserted since 22nd April, 5 leagues north-northwest of this point, after being trapped since 12th September 1846. The officers and crew, 105 souls under Captain F.R.M. Crozier, landed here. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June 1847. The whole lot of the expedition has been 9 officers and 15 men. These simple words, scrolled in the margins of an official admiral form and hidden in a can on King William Island, are the final testimony from Britain's most daring Arctic expedition. When Lieutenant William Hobson found the note 11 years later in 1859, he held in his hands the last record of 129 men who had sailed into the ice chasing glory and found only death. Known as the Victory Point Note, it marked the end of an adventure that had gripped Victorian Britain. But behind its official tone lay a human tragedy, one of brave officers and crew led by technology that was no match for the cruel Arctic. In 1845, the British admiral saw the Northwest Passage as the final prize of polar exploration. With most of the Canadian Arctic coastline mapped, only a small unknown gap remained. Sir John Barrow, the influential Second Secretary of the Admiralty, believed that modern ships and careful plans would finally solve a mystery that had troubled explorers for 300 years. The ships chosen for this mission were marvels of their time. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had already proved themselves in James Clark Ross's Antarctic expedition. Their hulls were reinforced with strong oak beams and iron plates to fight ice. Steam engines taken from railway locomotives gave them power when the wind failed, and a new heating system was meant to keep the crew warm through bitter winters. Iron wells allowed the propellers and rudders to be lifted into the hull to protect them from ice. The supplies were equally impressive. The ships carried 3 years' worth of food, salted meat, preserved soup, tinned vegetables, and even live cattle for fresh meat. A library of over 1,000 books was meant to help pass long winter nights, and scientific tools were on board to make magnetic and weather records. Every detail was planned to ensure success. Sir John Franklin, chosen to lead this grand mission, brought years of Arctic experience. At 59, he had earned a knighthood and the respect of his peers. His officers included the experienced Francis Crozier and the promising James Fitzjames. With 129 carefully chosen men, the expedition was the best Britain had to offer in maritime skill and bravery. The departure from Greenhive on May 19, 1845, was a national event. Crowds gathered along the Tempemes to watch the black-holed ship set off. Military bands played, and dignitaries spoke of British spirit and progress. The expedition carried not only the nation's hopes but also the faith that modern technology would overcome the harsh Arctic. The first months went as planned. The ship stopped in Orne for fresh water and sailed on to Greenland for final supplies. 5 sick men were sent home, leaving 129 men aboard. In late July, whaling ships in Baffin Bay spotted Terror and Erebus, waiting for the right ice conditions to enter Lancaster Sound. The crews looked healthy and full of hope. Franklin was sure they would complete the passage within 2 years. Then they vanished into the white silence of the Arctic, swallowed by ice and isolation, as if they had sailed off the edge of the world. What came next can only be pieced together from scattered clues and the final note. The expedition had reached Lancaster Sound and wintered at Beechey Island during 1845–46. 3 men, John Torrington, John Hartle, and William Braine, died that first winter. Their graves in the permafrost gave the first hints of the grim fate that lay ahead. In the summer of 1846, Franklin made a risky decision. Instead of taking the known eastern route around King William Island, he chose a shorter western passage shown on his maps. But those maps were wrong. King William Island was not connected to the mainland as expected. It was surrounded by shallow ice-filled waters even during short summers. The ship sailed into a trap, and what seemed a delay soon became a prison of ice. On September 12, 1846, the ships were locked in Victoria Strait northwest of King William Island. The advanced heating systems became coal-hungry machines, and the steam engines turned from saviors to heavy weights, pressing their hulls further into the frozen sea. That long Arctic winter of 1846–47 was a time of suffering. The tinned food began to reveal a deadly flaw. Poor soldiering leached lead into the supplies, slowly poisoning the men. Amid the harsh cold and rising scurvy, Sir John Franklin died. On June 11, 1847, a blow from which his command would never recover. The following winter, 1847–48, brought further hardship. More men died from lead poisoning, scurvy, and the relentless cold. Trapped in ice with dwindling food, the situation grew desperate. Then in April 1848, Captain Crozier faced the worst decision in Arctic exploration history. With supplies nearly exhausted and 24 men already lost, he ordered the abandonment of Terror and Erebus. The great ships, once symbols of Britain's naval power, were left as frozen tombs beneath the ice. 105 survivors gathered what little they had and prepared for an impossible journey. Their plan was to walk south across King William Island to reach the Back River on the Canadian mainland, and from there find the Hudson Bay outposts. This march was meant for healthy men with good weather and supplies, but these were scurvy, weakened sailors dragging makeshift sledges over broken ice. It was a march towards certain death. The final note, signed by Crozier and Fitzjames on April 25, 1848, shows no hint of the fear and desperation inside them. Its formal language follows naval rules as it records the calamity. Yet between the official lines lies the true human cost. Men who knew they were recording their own farewell, leaving the only evidence that they had once lived, fought, and died in service of Britain. What happened to the 105 men who left their ships that April remains one of history's most haunting mysteries. Archaeological finds suggest that many died on the southern shores of King William Island, their bodies scattered on the tundra. Some may have reached the mainland before fate overtook them, while others were forced into cannibalism in their final hours, as grim marks on recovered bones have shown. The irony of their fate is sharp. The eastern route that Franklin had rejected stayed open while his ships were trapped. It was a path later used by Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen in 1903-1906, who finally completed the Northwest Passage by choosing survival over speed. Franklin's expedition had in its own way completed the mapping of the passage. Yet without survivors, that success could not be shared with the world. For decades, search missions for Franklin's expedition were launched, adding new details to Britain's geographical knowledge. The mystery captured the imagination of Victorian society, inspiring books, songs, and art. Lady Franklin's relentless quest to learn her husband's fate became a national cause that outlived both the expedition and its commander. Today, modern technology has begun to reveal some of the secrets of that ill-fated voyage. The wrecks of both Erebus and Terror have been found and explored, and artifacts from the ships and camps speak of men who maintained strict naval discipline as their world slowly froze around them. Small personal items, buttons, pipes, and utensils offer intimate glimpses into lives cut short by ice and isolation. Yet, many questions remain. Did Franklin know he had taken the wrong route? How long did the survivors really live after leaving the ships? What drove disciplined naval officers to resort to acts of desperation? The Victory Point note gives us the facts but hides the full human story. The slow realization that even the best technology cannot conquer the forces of nature, and the final terrible choice between a slow death aboard a frozen ship or a desperate march into an uncertain future. Daniel Hayton expedition. The fire had destroyed everything. Major Daniel Hayton stood in the smoking ruins of Medina, watching his planned expedition turn to ash. His weapons were gone, supplies lay scattered across the charred ground. His interpreter had fled in the chaos, taking with him one of Hayton's precious horses and much of his remaining goods. It was March 1791, and the Irish explorer was stranded deep in West Africa with very little, save his determination to reach the legendary city of Timbuktu. Years later, villagers who discovered H. Houghton's camp found only a few bones bleaching in the desert sun. No weapons, no equipment, no message explaining what happened to the man who had ventured farther into Africa than any European before him. The Sahara had claimed another victim, swallowing Daniel H. Houghton as if he had never existed. The story began in London in 1790 amidst the drawing rooms of Britain's elite. The African Association had formed 2 years earlier, with a simple yet bold goal to solve the biggest geographical mystery of their time. Where did the Niger River flow? What secrets lay within Africa? Most tantalizing of all, where was Timbuktu, the fabled city of gold that had captivated European imaginations for centuries? The association had sent 2 expeditions, both ending in disaster. John Ledyard died of poisoning in Cairo before his journey even began. Simon Lucas was forced back from Tripoli when tribal wars blocked his way. The wealthy gentlemen funding these expeditions were growing impatient. They needed someone with real African experience, someone who understood the continent's dangers and could navigate its complexities. Daniel Hayton seemed to be the ideal choice. Born in County Tyrone in 1740, he'd served in the British Army, reaching the rank of major. More importantly, he'd spent 4 years on Gorée Island off the Senegal coast, learning local languages and connecting with African traders. He knew how to deal with local kings and chiefs and had survived the harsh climate. By 1790, however, Hayton found himself desperate. His military pension was not enough to support his family. Creditors were closing in. When he approached the African Association with a proposal to trace the Gambia River inland and find the source of the Niger, they saw opportunity in his desperation. Here was a man with nothing to lose and everything to prove. The association's instructions were ambitious. Hayton was to follow the Gambia River as far inland as possible, then strike northeast toward the Niger. He was to trace the great river's course and, if possible, follow it all the way to Timbuktu. For a successful mission, he would receive substantial payment. He could not afford to fail. On October 16, 1790, Hilton set sail from London. He reached the Gambia River on November 10th and was warmly welcomed by the King of Bara, whom he had befriended during his years at Gur. This reunion gave Hilton confidence. His local connections would help him. His knowledge of Mandingo would allow him to communicate effectively. His military training would carry him past the obstacles that had halted other explorers. Throughout the winter of 1790, Hayton prepared his expedition. He secured guides, porters, and horses to carry his supplies. He negotiated safe passage through various kingdoms along his route. By early 1791, everything was ready. Hayton began his march into the unknown, following ancient trading paths toward the mysterious interior. At first, everything went according to plan. Hayton's knowledge of the local language helped when he overheard traders plotting to kill him. They feared his presence would disrupt their business. He changed his route to avoid danger and pressed on toward inland kingdoms where no European had ever gone. But Africa tested Daniel H. Hayton further. In March 1791, disaster struck Medina. The entire town burned to the ground in a single day, destroying most of H. Hayton's equipment and weapons. His interpreter, sensing that the expedition might fail, abandoned him, taking valuable supplies and one of H. Hayton's horses. Suddenly, he found himself nearly alone in hostile territory hundreds of miles from the coast, with little more than the clothes on his back. A lesser man might have turned back, but H. Hayton had more than scientific curiosity or patriotic duty pushing him forward. His wife and 3 children depended on him. The debts that had driven him into this desperate journey would not vanish if he returned empty-handed. He'd come too far to quit now. Throughout the spring of 1791, Hayton pressed deeper into Africa. He crossed the Falmer River, a tributary of the Senegal, moving beyond the limits of earlier European exploration. In the kingdom of Bondu, he encountered a hostile prince who robbed him of possessions. Disease struck, leaving him feverish and weak. Yet he continued, driven by determination that impressed even his African hosts. By summer 1791, Hayton reached Fabana in the gold-rich kingdom of Bambuk. There, during the rainy season, he met a local trader who offered an extraordinary deal. He claimed to be traveling to Timbuktu and generously agreed to escort H. Hayton there for free. It felt like divine providence. After so many setbacks, Hayton had found hope. In July 1791, the 2 men set out for the fabled city. Hayton was within reach of his goal. He believed he would be the first European to reach Timbuktu, solve the Niger River mystery, and return to London in triumph. His family's financial struggles would be over. His name would be remembered among history's great explorers. From Simbing in moist territory, Hayton sent his final report in September 1791. He was alive, making progress and confident of success. Then silence fell across the Sahara. Daniel H. Hayton vanished as if the desert had opened and swallowed him whole. 2 years passed with no word from the missing explorer. The African Association sent inquiries through their network. They questioned traders and consulted chiefs. Rumors were examined. Finally, in 1793, the truth began to emerge from fragmentary accounts gathered by other travelers. According to these reports, Hayton's new companion had not been the generous benefactor he claimed to be. As they pushed north toward Timbuktu through desolate land, Hayton began to sense treachery. He made the decision that likely saved his life. He turned back alone, leaving his guide and crossing the desert in search of safety. But the Sahara in late 1791 was no place for a solo traveler. Without enough water, food, or local knowledge, he faced an impossible challenge. He managed to reach a watering hole called Tara, one of the oases that sustained life in the desert. However, the local inhabitants, suspicious of this foreigner, refused to help him. They denied him water. They would not sell him food. They watched as he grew weaker and more desperate each day. Daniel Heighton, the Irish major who survived military campaigns and African fevers, who learned local languages and negotiated with kings, died alone at a watering hole in the Sahara Desert. The exact date of his death remains unknown. His body was never found. The desert claimed him as it had countless others, leaving no trace of his final moments. Back in London, the African Association struggled to understand what happened to their missing explorer. The fragmentary reports painted a picture of a man who came close to achieving his goals before being undone by harsh desert travel. He had traveled farther into Africa than any European before him. He'd gathered valuable knowledge about the interior kingdoms. He'd shown that determined exploration was possible even if it cost him his life. Hin's disappearance had consequences that rippled far beyond the African Association's halls. His wife and 3 children were left without his military pension or the promised payment for his successful mission. Falling into desperate poverty, by 1794 they had been imprisoned for debt, reduced to the destitution that had initially driven H. Houghton to accept the perilous mission. The African Association, embarrassed by the fate of H. Houghton's family, successfully petitioned the Crown for a widow's pension. It was little comfort for a woman who had lost her husband to the desert, but it saved her and her children from complete ruin. Meanwhile, the quest for Timbuktu continued. New expeditions were sent, building on what H. Houghton had learned at great cost. Mango Park followed a similar route in 1795, becoming the first European to see the Niger River and confirm its eastern flow. But even Park's triumph was overshadowed by tragedy. He died on a second expedition in 1805, drowned in the river he had uncovered. It would take until 1826 for a European to finally reach Timbuktu. Major Alexander Gordon Lang of the Royal African Corps succeeded where H. Houghton and others had failed, walking through the gates of the legendary city after a grueling journey across the Sahara. Yet, like many others, Lang never made it home. He was murdered on his return journey. Another victim of the desert that fiercely guarded its secrets. George Bass Expedition. Every morning in Australia, thousands of motorists drive across the Bass Highway without knowing they are traveling on a road named after a man who disappeared into the Pacific Ocean over 2 centuries ago. Bass Strait, that treacherous stretch of water separating mainland Australia from Tasmania, carries his name on every map and navigation chart. Yet George Bass himself vanished so completely in 1803 that no trace of him or his crew was ever found. The mystery began on February 5, 1803, when Bass sailed out of Port Jackson, aboard the Venus bound for Tahiti. He had told Governor Philip King he was going to buy provisions for the struggling colony. What he did not say was that he might also attempt to trade illegally in Spanish Chile, where foreign merchants could make enormous profits if they were willing to risk imprisonment or death. Bass never reached Tahiti. He never returned to Sydney. The Venus simply disappeared into the vast Pacific, taking with it one of Australia's greatest explorers. George Bass had already earned his place in history by the time he made that final voyage. Born in 1771 in Lincolnshire, he had trained as a surgeon before joining the Royal Navy. In 1795, he arrived in Sydney aboard HMS Reliance, bringing with him a small boat he called Tom Thumb and an insatiable curiosity about the unknown coastline of New South Wales. With his friend Matthew Flenders, Bass had made a series of daring explorations in tiny boats, mapping rivers and harbours that no European had seen before. Their greatest achievement came in 1798 when they proved that Van Diemen's Land was an island separated from the mainland by a strait. Flinders generously named this waterway Bass Strait, ensuring his friend's place on the map forever. But exploration paid poorly, and Bass had debts to settle and a new wife to support. In 1801, he'd returned to Sydney as part owner of the Venus, hoping to make his fortune in trade. The venture failed spectacularly. The colonial market was flooded with goods, and Bass found himself deeper in debt than ever. Desperate for money, he accepted a government contract to bring salt pork from Tahiti to feed Sydney's growing population. The pork run proved profitable, but it was not enough to clear Bass's debts or reunite him with his wife Elizabeth in England. By early 1803, he was planning something more ambitious and far more dangerous. Spanish colonies in South America were hungry for manufactured goods, and their isolation meant prices were astronomical. The Spanish government strictly prohibited foreign traders, but the potential profits were so vast that many captains were willing to risk capture. Bass had good reasons for attempting this dangerous trade. He knew Spanish from his Navy days, and he carried a letter from Governor King vouching for his character. If questioned by Spanish authorities, he could claim he had been blown off course while sailing to Tahiti. Most importantly, he was running out of options. His creditors in Sydney were growing impatient, and his wife in London was surviving on the charity of relatives. On that February morning in 1803, Bass sailed out of Sydney Harbour with a crew of about 25 men. The Venus was well provisioned for a long voyage carrying trade goods that Bass hoped to sell in Chile or Peru. Governor King had given him official papers stating that his purpose was to buy provisions in Tahiti. What Bass planned to do after that remained his secret. Weeks passed with no word from the Venus. Months stretched into years. Other ships returned from the Pacific with news of their voyages, but none had seen Bass or his vessel. Governor King sent inquiries through his network of contacts. Ships' captains were questioned whenever they reached port. Gradually, the awful truth became clear. George Bass and the Venus had simply vanished. The first theory suggested that Bass had reached Chile and been captured by Spanish authorities. A captain named William Campbell claimed to have heard that Bass was imprisoned in silver mines somewhere in South America. For years, this story gave hope to Bass's friends and family. Perhaps he was alive but unable to communicate. Perhaps he would eventually be released and make his way home. But as time passed, this theory crumbled. In 1808, Spain released all British prisoners held in Chile and Peru as part of a diplomatic agreement. If Bass had been captured, he would have been freed with the others. No, George Bass appeared on any prisoner list. No member of his crew ever came forward with a story of capture and imprisonment. Other theories emerged. Some suggested that Bass had been murdered by his own crew, who then scuttled the Venus and claimed it had been wrecked. Others proposed that he had changed his identity and settled in South America under a false name. The most romantic theory held that he'd found love in some remote Pacific island and chose never to return to the civilized world. The most likely explanation is also the most tragic. Bass probably died of thirst and starvation somewhere. In the vast Pacific, the Venus may have been wrecked on an uncharted reef or simply run out of supplies during a voyage that proved longer and more difficult than Bass had anticipated. The Pacific Ocean covers 1/3 of the Earth's surface, and in 1803 much of it was completely unknown to European navigators. In 1903, exactly a century after Bass's disappearance, Spanish archives were searched for any mention of him or his crew. Nothing was found. In 2003, Peruvian records were examined with the same result. Modern researchers have found no trace of the Venus or any evidence that Bass ever reached South America. The disappearance devastated Bass's young wife, Elizabeth. She had married him in 1800, just 3 months before he sailed for Australia. They had spent only 10 weeks together as husband and wife. For 3 years, she waited for news, surviving on hope and the charity of her brother. In 1806, the British Admiral Tighe officially declared Bass lost at sea and granted Elizabeth a widow's pension. She never remarried and died in 1824, still wearing her wedding ring. Bass's mother, Sarah, lived to the age of 92, always hoping her son might return. She died in 1828 in Lincoln, having outlived him by at least 25 years. The family was never wealthy, and Bass's disappearance left them in difficult circumstances. The fortune he'd hoped to make in the Pacific remained forever beyond their reach. Despite his tragic end, George Bass's contributions to Australian exploration cannot be overstated. His detailed charts and observations form the foundation for all future navigation around the Australian coast. His discovery of Bass Strait revolutionized sea travel between Sydney and Tasmania, cutting weeks off the journey and saving countless lives that would have been lost to the dangerous waters around the southern tip of Tasmania. Bass was more than just an explorer. He was a skilled naturalist who collected and described dozens of Australian plants and animals previously unknown to science. His anatomical studies of the wombat were among the first scientific descriptions of this unique marsupial. He observed and recorded the behavior of native birds, the properties of Australian timber, and the characteristics of Aboriginal communities he encountered. His surveying work was remarkably accurate for the time. Charts based on his observations remained in use for decades, guiding ships safely through previously unknown waters. His method of combining careful measurement with detailed written descriptions became the standard for maritime exploration in the Pacific. The search for Bass changed the way authorities handled missing vessels. The extensive inquiries launched after his disappearance established procedures that are still used today when ships vanish at sea. His case demonstrated the importance of maintaining detailed records of vessel movements and established communication networks between distant ports. Bass's legacy lives on in the geography of Australia. Bass Strait remains one of the most important shipping routes in the Southern Hemisphere, connecting Tasmania to the mainland. The Bass Highway carries travellers across Tasmania, while Bass Hill and Bass Point in New South Wales commemorate his explorations. The town of Bass in Victoria sits near waters he first charted. In 1963, Australia Post honoured George Bass with a commemorative stamp. In 1998, another stamp was issued, featuring both Bass and Matthew Flenders, recognising their partnership in exploration. These small tokens of remembrance keep alive the memory of a man whose final voyage remains one of the sea's great mysteries. Modern navigation technology has eliminated much of the danger that Bass faced. Satellite communication means that no vessel needs to disappear without trace. GPS systems provide precise positioning that BAS could never have imagined. Weather forecasting gives captains advanced warning of storms that might have caught the Venus unprepared. Ludwig Leichhardt Expedition McPherson Station, Cagoon, April 3, 1848. The letter that Ludwig Leichhardt penned that morning carried no hint of the doom awaiting his expedition. His handwriting was steady, his tone confident, as he described the journey ahead. 7 men and 77 head of cattle were preparing to cross an entire continent, following a route that would take them from Queensland to the Swan River colony in Western Australia. It was the last anyone would hear from the Prussian explorer who had already achieved fame by crossing northern Australia 3 years earlier. Leichhardt sealed the letter and handed it to Alan McPherson, owner of the cattle station where they had spent their final night in civilized company. The expedition would depart at sunrise, heading west into territory that existed only as blank spaces on colonial maps. None of the 7 men who rode away from Con Station that morning would ever be seen alive again. But the moment that sealed their fate had occurred days earlier, when Leichhardt made a decision that would lead them all to disaster. Somewhere between the settled districts and the endless scrubland ahead, he chose a route that veteran bushmen had warned against. The explorer, who had successfully navigated over 3,000 miles of unknown territory, was about to make the mistake that would erase him from history. Leich's plan seemed logical enough when sketched out in Sydney drawing rooms. He would follow explorer Thomas Mitchell's track westward to the Baku River, then strike north to avoid the worst of Australia's central deserts. The route would take them through country that supported Aboriginal communities and had reliable water sources. It was ambitious but not impossible for an experienced party with adequate supplies. The party that assembled in Brisbane in early 1848 reflected Leichhardt's confidence in the venture. Adolf Classen, a young German immigrant, brought enthusiasm and basic medical knowledge. Arthur Hentig, another German, had farming experience that would prove valuable when managing their livestock. Donald Stewart, a Scottish stockman from the Darling Downs, understood cattle and knew how to read the country. The two Aboriginal guides, W and Billy, carried the local knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. Everything appeared perfectly organized. 77 head of cattle would provide fresh meat throughout the journey. 7 horses carried equipment and supplies for what Leichhardt estimated would be a 2-year crossing. The party had firearms, scientific instruments, and enough trade goods to establish friendly relations with Aboriginal tribes they might encounter. But experienced colonists noticed troubling signs from the beginning. The expedition was traveling during the wrong season, departing as the dry period approached rather than waiting for the wet season when water would be more plentiful. Leichhardt's route would take them through country that even Aboriginal people avoided during drought years. Most critically, the party was too small for such an ambitious undertaking. These concerns meant nothing to Leichhardt. He had spent 3 years planning this expedition and would not be deterred by pessimistic advice. His successful Port Essington journey had proven that determination and scientific method could overcome any obstacle the Australian continent presented. He believed his reputation and experience made him immune to the disasters that claimed lesser explorers. The first weeks proceeded smoothly enough. The party made steady progress westward, following established tracks through settled country. They crossed the Darling Downs without incident, their cattle thriving on the good grass. At night, they camped beside reliable water sources and took careful astronomical observations to fix their position. Everything suggested that Leichhardt's confidence was justified. Then they reached the point where known country ended and true exploration began. The comfortable world of established stations and marked tracks disappeared behind them. Ahead lay thousands of miles of territory that existed only in the imagination of map makers who drew neat lines across blank spaces. This was where had to make the critical decisions that would determine whether his expedition achieved immortal fame or joined the ranks of those claimed by the Australian interior. The fatal choice came in May 1848 when the party reached the headwaters of the Baku River system. Local Aboriginal people, probably Karingbal or Yemen groups, made contact with the expedition and attempted to communicate information about the country ahead. They drew maps in the dirt and pointed in specific directions, clearly trying to warn the strangers about something dangerous. Leichhardt had enough experience to recognize a warning when he saw one. Aboriginal people possessed detailed knowledge of their country that could keep travelers alive in situations where European maps and scientific instruments proved useless. Their advice had saved his first expedition on multiple occasions. Any prudent explorer would have listened carefully to what these people were trying to communicate. But Leichhardt faced a terrible dilemma. Following Aboriginal advice might mean abandoning his planned route and accepting a much longer journey through unknown country. His supplies were calculated for a specific timeline, and any major deviation could leave the party dangerously short of provisions. More importantly, changing direction would mean admitting that his careful planning had been inadequate. Pride made the decision for him. Leichhardt thanked the Aboriginal informants politely, but continued on his planned route. He would follow the Baku system north and west exactly as he had outlined in his letters to Sydney sponsors. The warnings of people who had lived in this country for thousands of years were dismissed in favour of compass bearings and European confidence. Within days of rejecting this crucial advice, the expedition entered what Aboriginal people called the land of no return. The country changed dramatically as they moved northwest. Reliable water sources disappeared. The grass that had sustained their cattle became sparse and poor. Most ominously, they encountered no further Aboriginal camps or sign of human presence. They had entered territory that even the traditional owners avoided during dry periods. By June 1848, disaster was closing in from all directions. Their cattle began dying from lack of water and feed. The horses were weakening from the constant travel over increasingly difficult terrain. Worst of all, the water sources marked on Leichhardt's maps either no longer existed or had never been reliable in the first place. The expedition faced the classic Australian disaster: too far from help, running out of water in country that could not support them. Everything that followed remained speculation based on fragmentary evidence discovered decades later. Search parties found scattered bones and artifacts that might have belonged to Leichhardt's expedition, but nothing that conclusively explained their fate. The most likely scenario suggests they wandered in desperate circles, searching for water that did not exist until heat and thirst claimed them one by one. The irony of Leichhardt's disappearance lies in how close he came to success. Modern research indicates his planned route was basically sound and would have worked during good seasons. Aboriginal communities did live along the path he intended to follow, and water sources existed at regular intervals, but 1848 was a drought year, and the timing of his departure meant traveling during the worst possible conditions. Russian polar expedition of 1900 to 1902. The telegram sat unopened on Baron Edward Von's desk for 3 days in May 1900, its official seal still intact. When he finally broke it, the message from the Russian Academy of Sciences was brief but fateful: approval for his expedition to find Sanov land. His colleagues in St. Petersburg had watched him pace the halls of the Academy for years, clutching maps and charts, describing the mythical island he'd glimpsed from the new Siberian islands in 1886. Now, after 14 years of persistent lobbying, the Academy would fund his obsession with 200,000 rubles and the ship Zarya. But approval had not come without serious reservations. At the Academy's final meeting before departure, Professor Alexander Karpinski raised uncomfortable questions about the expedition's goals. Sannikov land, he pointed out, might not exist at all. The island had been sighted multiple times over the decades, always from great distances, always in conditions that could create optical illusions. Even if it did exist, Karpinski warned it might be nothing more than a temporary ice formation that had long since melted away. Admiral Steen-Marov was even more direct in his concerns. The Zarya, he noted, was a converted whaling vessel that had never been tested in the crushing ice conditions of the East Siberian Sea. Her wooden hull, while reinforced for Arctic service, was still vulnerable to the massive pressure ridges that could build up in those waters. More troubling was the ship's dependence on coal for her steam engine. If they became trapped in ice for extended periods, fuel consumption would quickly outpace their supplies. The expedition's route also drew criticism from Arctic veterans. Captain Nikolai Colt V, who had sailed northern waters for 3 decades, urged Toll to abandon his planned approach through the Laptop Sea. The ice conditions there were notoriously unpredictable, he warned. Ships had been crushed or trapped for years in waters that appeared navigable. A safer route would take them further east, but this would require abandoning the search for Sakov land altogether. Even Toll's scientific colleagues expressed private doubts. His fixation on finding the Phantom Island, they feared, was clouding his judgment as an expedition leader. The mission had legitimate scientific goals: mapping uncharted territories, collecting geological samples, studying Arctic wildlife. But these objectives seemed secondary to Toll's personal quest. Dr. Herman Walter, the expedition's astronomer, confided to friends that he worried about serving under a commander whose primary motivation appeared to be proving the existence of something that might be a mirage. The warnings extended to technical matters as well. The Zarya's captain, Fudor Matteson, noted problems with the ship's steering mechanism during sea trials. The vessel responded sluggishly to helm commands, a potentially fatal flaw when navigating through shifting ice floes. The ship's heating system also showed concerning defects, failing to maintain adequate temperatures in simulated Arctic conditions. Financial concerns added another layer of worry. The expedition's budget was tight even by Russian standards, leaving little room for unexpected expenses or extended delays. If the ship became trapped in ice, as frequently happened in Arctic waters, the costs of rescue operations could bankrupt the entire mission. Several Academy members quietly suggested postponing the expedition until more funding could be secured. The crew selection process revealed additional problems. Experienced Arctic sailors were reluctant to sign on for what many viewed as a fool's errand. Those who did join often demanded premium wages, straining the budget further. The ship's complement included several young officers with limited polar experience, men who had never faced the psychological challenges of Arctic isolation and constant danger. Even nature seemed to protest the expedition's departure. The spring of 1900 brought unusually harsh weather to St. Petersburg, with late snows and bitter winds that delayed final preparations. The Zarya's sea trials were postponed repeatedly due to ice in the harbour. When the ship finally departed in late June, she sailed under grey skies that seemed to mirror the sombre mood of those who watched her leave. The voyage began badly and grew worse. Within weeks, the Zarya encountered ice conditions that exceeded all predictions. The ship became trapped repeatedly, her hull groaning under the pressure of massive ice flows. Coal consumption far exceeded estimates as the crew struggled to maintain steam for the pumps and heating systems. By autumn, it was clear they would spend the winter locked in ice. The first winter brought scurvy, mechanical failures, and growing tensions between Toll and Captain Madison. The Baron's single-minded focus on reaching Sanov land led to increasingly risky decisions that endangered the entire expedition. When leadids opened in the ice, Toll insisted on pushing north toward his Phantom Island rather than seeking safer waters to the south. The second winter was worse. Food supplies dwindled as the ship remained trapped. Several crew members died of illness and exposure. The Zarya's wooden hull began to fail under the constant pressure of shifting ice. Still, Toll refused to abandon his quest. In the spring of 1902, with rescue becoming unlikely, he made his fatal decision. Taking 3 companions, Toll set out across the ice toward Bennett Island, the closest point to where he believed Sanov land lay hidden. His plan was to establish a base there and continue searching for his mythical island. The small party carried minimal supplies, expecting the Zarya to retrieve them within weeks, but the ship remained trapped in ice. Unable to reach their location on Bennett Island, Toll and his companions survived through the brief Arctic summer by hunting seabirds and the few reindeer they found. As autumn approached with no sign of rescue, their situation became desperate. In October 1902, with winter closing in and no hope of the Zarya reaching them, Toll made his final gamble. The 4 men launched their small boats into the ice-choked waters of the East Siberian Sea, attempting to reach the new Siberian islands. They were never seen again. Their boats, equipment, and bodies disappeared into the Arctic wilderness, claimed by the same forces that had tried to warn against their journey from the beginning. Taranova Expedition, Scott's final journey. The tent was silent except for the howling Antarctic wind on March 29, 1912. Inside, 3 men lay dying in their sleeping bags just 11 miles from the supplies that might have saved them. Robert Falcon Scott made his final diary entry with frozen fingers, writing words that would become legendary. "For God's sake, look after our people." Outside, the blizzard that had trapped them for 9 days continued to rage across the Ross ice shelf. By the time it cleared, Scott and his 2 remaining companions would be dead, victims of the most famous failure in polar exploration history. But how did Britain's most celebrated Antarctic expedition reach this frozen grave? The journey to disaster began 14 months earlier, not with courage or determination, but with a series of decisions that would doom 5 men to die in one of Earth's most unforgiving places. The fatal choice came on January 3rd, 1912, when Scott stood at 87 degrees 32 minutes south latitude, just 150 mi from the South Pole. Behind him stretched 750 mi of Antarctic wasteland. Ahead lay the prize that had driven him to risk everything. At that exact moment, facing the most important decision of the expedition, Scott made the choice that would kill them all. He decided to take 5 men to the South Pole instead of 4. The decision seemed logical at the time. Scott had planned for a 4-man polar party, but as they approached their goal, he couldn't bear to send Edgar Evans back with the final support team. Evans was the strongest man on the expedition, a petty officer who had served with Scott before. Lieutenant Henry Bowers had proven himself invaluable as navigator and photographer, Dr. Edward. Wilson was Scott's closest friend and the expedition's chief scientist. Captain Lawrence Oates commanded the ponies and knew the ice conditions better than anyone. Standing in the Antarctic wind, Scott convinced himself that 5 men would be safer than 4. They would have more strength to haul their sledges, more expertise to navigate the treacherous route home. What he failed to calculate was the mathematics of death. Their food and fuel had been calculated for 4 men. Dividing these supplies among 5 meant each man would receive 20% less nutrition and warmth. In the brutal Antarctic environment, this seemingly small difference would become the margin between life and death. The problems began immediately. 5 men in a tent designed for 4 meant cramped, uncomfortable nights with inadequate rest. The sledge loads were heavier because they couldn't abandon Evans's equipment and supplies. Most critically, their daily food rations dropped from an already inadequate 4,500 calories per man to just 3,600 calories. Modern research shows that men hauling sledges across Antarctica need at least 7,000 calories per day. Scott's men were slowly starving from the moment they left for the pole, but the real catastrophe was yet to come. On January 17th, after 78 days of grueling travel, Scott's team finally reached the South Pole. Instead of finding virgin snow in the triumph of first discovery, they saw a black flag snapping in the polar wind. Roald Amundsen's Norwegian team had beaten them by 34 days. The psychological blow was devastating. Scott had staked his reputation, his expedition's funding, and the honor of the British Empire on being first to the pole. Finding Amundsen's tent with its mocking note of congratulations crushed the morale of men already weakened by insufficient food and extreme cold. They took the required photographs and measurements, but their hearts were broken. The return journey began not as a victory march, but as a retreat from failure. Within days, the expedition began falling apart. Edgar Evans, the strongest member of the team, started showing signs of serious decline. The big man needed more calories than his smaller companions, but everyone received identical rations. By early February, Evans was stumbling and falling behind. His hands were frostbitten, his nose blackened with cold injury. Secret head wounds from falls into creases while descending the Beardmore Glacier was slowly killing him. On February 17th, near the foot of the glacier, Evans collapsed completely. Scott found him on his knees in the snow with his clothes disheveled and frostbitten hands uncovered. He was mumbling incoherently, his mind damaged by cold and starvation. They dragged him to their lunch camp, but he died that afternoon, becoming the first victim of Scott's fatal decision to take 5 men instead of 4. The death of Evans should have improved the survivors' chances. With 4 men sharing supplies meant for 4, their daily rations increased slightly, but the damage was already done. Weeks of inadequate nutrition had weakened them all. Lawrence Oates was suffering from severe frostbite in both feet, made worse by an old war wound that had left one leg shorter than the other. Dr. Wilson was developing scurvy from vitamin deficiency. Scott himself was showing early signs of the starvation that would eventually kill him. By March, Oates could barely walk. His feet were black with gangrene, and he knew he was slowing the team's progress towards safety. On March 16th, during a blizzard that trapped them in their tent, Oates made his own fatal decision. He told his companions, "I'm just going outside, and maybe some time," then walked out into the storm to die. His sacrifice was meant to give the others a better chance of survival, but it came too late. The final three men, Scott, Wilson, and Bowers, pushed on for 3 more days before being trapped by another blizzard just 11 miles from One Ton Depot where they had cache supplies. They had fuel for only 2 cups of tea each and food for 2 days. The storm continued for 9 days while they lay in their tent, growing weaker with each passing hour. Wilson and Bowers might have tried to reach the depot, but Scott's feet were too damaged by frostbite for him to travel. They chose to stay together and die together rather than abandon their leader. On March 29th, Scott made his final diary entry, then closed the notebook forever. The 3 men died sometime in the following days, probably from hypothermia combined with starvation. The irony was cruel. If Scott had stuck to his original plan of 4 men, they would have had adequate supplies for the return journey. 4 men could have moved faster, especially after Evans began to weaken. They might have reached One Ton Depot before the final blizzard trapped them. Even with the disappointment of finding Amundsen's flag at the pole, they could have returned as heroes who had reached the South Pole and lived to tell the story. The mathematics of Scott's mistake was simple and deadly. Taking 25% more men while carrying the same amount of supplies reduced each man's daily calories by 20%. Over the course of a journey lasting months, this created a death spiral of weakness, cold injury, and despair that made survival impossible. Scott's own writings reveal his growing awareness of the catastrophe he'd created. By late February, he was noting in his diary that they were all getting thinner, especially Evans. By March, he was calculating whether they had enough food to reach safety, always coming up short. His final entries are filled with regret and the growing realization that his decisions had doomed them all. The search party found their bodies 8 months later on November 12, 1912. Scott lay in the middle of the tent with his sleeping bag opened and his arms stretched toward Wilson. They had died as they had lived as gentlemen and explorers, but their deaths were preventable. A different decision on January 3, 1912, would have brought them home alive and triumphant instead of making them the most famous casualties in the history of polar exploration. Vladimir Rusanov expedition. The Arctic ice of the Kara stretched endlessly in every direction. It was August 1914 and Otto Spurdan, Norwegian explorer, squinted through his binoculars from the deck of the Ware Eclipse. He was searching for any trace of a missing ship called Hercules. For 2 summers, search parties had combed these frozen waters, finding nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no survivors. Vladimir Rusanov and his 14 companions had simply vanished. It would be 22 years before anyone found the first clue about what happened to them. The discovery came in 1934 on a windswept island. A survey vessel named Stalinets was mapping the southeastern shores of the K-Sea. When the crew spotted something unusual on a rocky outcrop, they called it Vasil Island, but it would later be renamed Hercules Island in honor of what they found. Near the shoreline stood a weathered wooden post, battered by decades of Arctic storms. Carved into its surface were the words Hercules in 1913, and below that the letters VP. The post was placed in a can of carefully stacked stones. Someone had marked this spot deliberately, perhaps as a grave. The wooden post was the first solid evidence that Rusanov's expedition had traveled far beyond their last known position. But it raised more questions than answers. Who had carved those initials? How long had they survived in such a desolate place? And what had happened to the rest of the crew? To understand how these men came to die alone in one of the world's harshest environments, we need to go back to the beginning. June 1912 marked the start of their story, which began not with disaster, but with success. Vladimir Rosanov, born in 1875 in the Russian city of Orel, was a man driven by two passions, science and revolution. After studying geology at university, he spent years in prison for his Marxist political activities. It was during his imprisonment that he first learned of Arctic exploration. The tales of Fridtjof Nansen's polar voyages captivated him. After his release and exile to Siberia, he escaped to Paris and completed a doctorate in geology at the Sorbonne. When he returned to Russia in 1907, Rosanov threw himself into Arctic exploration. He successfully led expeditions to Novaya Zemlya, an island chain in the Arctic Ocean. These journeys gave him experience navigating treacherous waters and pack ice. More importantly, they convinced him he could find a sea route from the Atlantic to the Pacific across the top of Russia, which he called the Northern Sea Route. He believed this route could transform Russian trade, allowing the transport of Siberian grain, lumber, and minerals to world markets. By spring 1912, the Russian government decided to act on Rusanov's expertise. They commissioned him to lead an expedition to Spitzberg and to investigate coal deposits. Foreign mining companies were already claiming land on the island, and Russia wanted its share. Rusanov was allowed considerable freedom in organizing the expedition and selecting his crew. His personnel choices reflected both scientific ambition and personal ties. For his assistant and ship captain, he recruited Alexander Kuchin, a navigator who had served on Roald Amundson's famous Fram expedition. The scientific team included geologist Rudolf Samoyk and biologist Zenon Vartos. Most controversially, Rasanov insisted on bringing his fiancée, Juliet John Syne, a talented woman pursuing geology and medicine degrees. They purchased a 63-ton sealer named Hercules, built in 1908 and tested in Greenland waters. Rusanov was confident in the ship's capabilities, though some colleagues doubted her suitability for Arctic exploration. On June 26, 1912, Hercules set sail from Alexandrovsk with 11 people aboard. The expedition reached Spitzbergen on July 3rd and quickly began their geological survey. Over the next 6 weeks, Rusanov's team traversed 200 kilometers, staking 28 claims on promising coal deposits. The official mission was a complete success, but Rasanov had bigger plans. Once the Spitzbergen survey was complete, he announced his intention to sail east rather than return home, proposing to investigate the Northern Sea Route that had fascinated him for years. He asked for volunteers to join this unauthorized extension of their mission. Not everyone was eager to take the risk. Geologist Samoyk and biologist Vartos returned to Norway on a passing steamer, taking with them the expedition's scientific collections and reports. They also took a sailor, a Papapov, who was in poor health. Before leaving, Samoyk tried to dissuade Rusanov from his plan, arguing their supplies were inadequate for wintering in the Arctic, and their vessel too small for such perilous journey. Rusanov dismissed these concerns, expressing confidence in his abilities and his ship. In a letter to his mother, he wrote, "We can winter perfectly well. We are extremely well supplied. The ship is strong with plenty of experience in ice. Do not worry about us." 8 members of the original expedition chose to continue east with Rusanov, along with Kuchin and Jean Saucine. The group included student engineer Konstantin Semanov and 5 sailors. On August 31, 1912, they reached the western end of Matkin-Shah Strait on Nova Zlia. Rusanov left a message at a net settlement stating his intent around the northern tip of Enva Zlia and sail east across the Kar Sea. His planned route was ambitious. He aimed to sail past Udinia Island, the new Siberian Islands, and Wrangel Island. If successful, he would achieve the Northeast Passage that had eluded explorers for centuries. That was the last message anyone received from Vladimir Rusanov. As autumn turned to winter, and then to spring, concern for the expedition grew. By 1913, 2 other Russian Arctic expeditions led by Georgy Brusilov and Georgy Sidov had also gone missing. The simultaneous disappearance of 3 expeditions sparked public outcry. The Russian Geographical Society lobbied the government for rescue missions. But where could searches even begin? Rusanov's final message was vague about his exact route. The Karasy's vastness and the harsh conditions in 1912 and 13 with unusual amounts of pack ice complicated matters. Officials criticized the three expedition leaders for their incredible irresponsibility in planning. The rescue mission was assigned to Otto Sverdrup, the Norwegian explorer. By August 1914, Sverdrup was fighting heavy ice in the Kara Sea. In September, his ship became trapped off the Taimyr Peninsula and he was forced to winter there. Radio contact with Russian Navy icebreakers led to orders for Sverdrup to abandon the search for Hercules and assist in evacuating crew from trapped naval vessels. The following summer, Sverdrup resumed his search but found nothing. Aviator Jan Nagorski flew the first polar flights that summer, attempting to find the lost expeditions. Then World War I intervened, halting further search efforts. For 20 years, the fate of Rasanov and his crew remained a mystery. In 1934, the survey ship Stalinets found the wooden post on what became Hercules Island. That same year, another discovery provided additional clues. Survey crew member M. Sihanouk explored an islet in the Menina Skerries, southwest of Hercules Island. He found artifacts scattered around a makeshift shelter, remnants of a hunting knife, a camera, clothing, and spent shotgun shells. Most significantly, he discovered papers belonging to expedition member Chukchin and a watch belonging to sailor V. Popov. 2 years later, searchers returned to the site and found a notebook in Rasanov's handwriting. The evidence suggested that during 1913, as supplies ran low, Rasanov sent some crew members back towards civilization on foot. Popov and Chukchin were reportedly among those chosen for this journey towards settlements along the Yanis River. In the 1970s, researchers examining old records made another connection. A 1921 search party looking for 2 men lost from Amundsen's Maud expedition found several old campsites on the Mayoff Peninsula. These sites contained shotgun shells and other items previously attributed to the missing mudmen. But when items found at the Menuseries were compared, researchers realized they belonged to Rusanov's crew, not Amundsen's. What emerged from these discoveries was both remarkable and tragic. Rusanov had achieved the first part of his ambitious plan. Hercules had rounded the northern tip of Novaya Zemlya and crossed the Kara Sea, reaching the area near the Taimyr Peninsula. They survived at least through 1913, likely longer than anyone expected. Yet, something had gone disastrously wrong. Perhaps their ship was crushed in the ice. Perhaps they became trapped during the harsh winter of 1913. At some point, Rusanov made the decision to split his party. Some members, including Popov and Chukchin, were sent south on foot toward the Yanesa River settlements. They left Marcus behind on Hercules Island, but never reached safety. In 2000, an expedition from Rusanov's hometown found human bones near Mount Min, likely belonging to Captain Kuchin. It was the closest anyone had come to finding the members of the expedition. For rare expedition, the ink had barely dried on the parchment when the clerk sealed it away in the archives of. Were all getting thinner, especially Evans. By March, he was calculating whether they had enough food to reach safety, always coming up short. His final entries are filled with regret and the growing realization that his decisions had doomed them all. The search party found their bodies 8 months later on November 12, 1912. Scott lay in the middle of the tent with his sleeping bag opened and his arms stretched toward Wilson. They had died as they had lived as gentlemen and explorers, but their deaths were preventable. A different decision on January 3, 1912, would have brought them home alive and triumphant instead of making them the most famous casualties in the history of polar exploration. Vladimir Rusanov expedition. The Arctic ice of the Kara stretched endlessly in every direction. It was August 1914 and Otto Sverdrup, Norwegian explorer, squinted through his binoculars from the deck of the Ware Eclipse. He was searching for any trace of a missing ship called Hercules. For 2 summers, search parties had combed these frozen waters, finding nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no survivors. Vladimir Rusanov and his 14 companions had simply vanished. It would be 22 years before anyone found the first clue about what happened to them. The discovery came in 1934 on a windswept island. A survey vessel named Stalinets was mapping the southeastern shores of the K-Sea. When the crew spotted something unusual on a rocky outcrop, they called it Vasil Island, but it would later be renamed Hercules Island in honor of what they found. Near the shoreline stood a weathered wooden post, battered by decades of Arctic storms. Carved into its surface were the words Hercules in 1913, and below that the letters VP. The post was placed in a cairn of carefully stacked stones. Someone had marked this spot deliberately, perhaps as a grave. The wooden post was the first solid evidence that Rusanov's expedition had travelled far beyond their last known position. But it raised more questions than answers. Who had carved those initials? How long had they survived in such a desolate place? And what had happened to the rest of the crew? To understand how these men came to die alone in one of the world's harshest environments, we need to go back to the beginning. June 1912 marked the start of their story, which began not with disaster, but with success. Vladimir Rusanov, born in 1875 in the Russian city of Oral, was a man driven by 2 passions, science and revolution. After studying geology at university, he spent years in prison for his Marxist political activities. It was during his imprisonment that he first learned of Arctic exploration. The tales of Fridtjof Nansen's polar voyages captivated him. After his release and exile to Siberia, he escaped to Paris and completed a doctorate in geology at the Sorbonne. When he returned to Russia in 1907, Rusanov threw himself into Arctic exploration. He successfully led expeditions to Novaya Zemlya, an island chain in the Arctic Ocean. These journeys gave him experience navigating treacherous waters and pack ice. More importantly, they convinced him he could find a sea route from the Atlantic to the Pacific across the top of Russia, which he called the Northern Sea Route. He believed this route could transform Russian trade, allowing the transport of Siberian grain, lumber, and minerals to world markets. By spring 1912, the Russian government decided to act on Rusanov's expertise. They commissioned him to lead an expedition to Spitzberg and to investigate coal deposits. Foreign mining companies were already claiming land on the island, and Russia wanted its share. Rusanov was allowed considerable freedom in organizing the expedition and selecting his crew. His personnel choices reflected both scientific ambition and personal ties. For his assistant and ship captain, he recruited Alexander Kuchin, a navigator who had served on Roald Amundsen's famous Fram expedition. The scientific team included geologist Rudolf Samoyk and biologist Zenon Vartos. Most controversially, Rusanov insisted on bringing his fiancée Juliet John Syne, a talented woman pursuing geology and medicine degrees. They purchased a 63-ton sealer named Hercules, built in 1908 and tested in Greenland waters. Rusanov was confident in the ship's capabilities, though some colleagues doubted her suitability for Arctic exploration. On June 26, 1912, Hercules set sail from Alexandrovsk with 11 people aboard. The expedition reached Spitzberg on July 3rd and quickly began their geological survey. Over the next 6 weeks, Rusanov's team traversed 1,200 kilometers, staking 28 claims on promising coal deposits. The official mission was a complete success, but Rusanov had bigger plans. Once the Spitsbergen survey was complete, he announced his intention to sail east rather than return home, proposing to investigate the Northern Sea Route that had fascinated him for years. He asked for volunteers to join this unauthorized extension of their mission. Not everyone was eager to take the risk. Geologist Samoyk and biologist Vartos returned to Norway on a passing steamer, taking with them the expedition's scientific collections and reports. They also took a sailor, a Papapov, who was in poor health. Before leaving, Samoic tried to dissuade Rusanov from his plan, arguing their supplies were inadequate for wintering in the Arctic, and their vessel too small for such perilous journey. Rusanov dismissed these concerns, expressing confidence in his abilities and his ship. In a letter to his mother, he wrote, "We can winter perfectly well. We are extremely well supplied. The ship is strong with plenty of experience in ice. Do not worry about us." 8 members of the original expedition chose to continue east with Rusanov, along with Kuchin and Jean Saucine. The group included student engineer Konstantin Semanov and 5 sailors. On August 31, 1912, they reached the western end of Matkin-Shah Strait on Nova Zlia. Rusanov left a message at a net settlement stating his intent around the northern tip of Enva Zlia and sail east across the Kar Sea. His planned route was ambitious. He aimed to sail past Udinia Island, the new Siberian Islands, and Wrangel Island. If successful, he would achieve the Northeast Passage that had looted explorers for centuries. That was the last message anyone received from Vladimir Rusanov. As autumn turned to winter and then to spring, concern for the expedition grew. By 1913, 2 other Russian Arctic expeditions led by Georgy Brusilov and Georgy Sidov had also gone missing. The simultaneous disappearance of 3 expeditions sparked public outcry. The Russian Geographical Society lobbied the government for rescue missions. But where could searches even begin? Rusanov's final message was vague about his exact route. The Kara Sea's vastness and the harsh conditions in 1912 and 13 with unusual amounts of pack ice complicated matters. Officials criticized the 3 expedition leaders for their incredible irresponsibility in planning. The rescue mission was assigned to Otto Sverdrup, the Norwegian explorer. By August 1914, Sverdrup was fighting heavy ice in the Kar Sea. In September, his ship became trapped off the Taimyr Peninsula and he was forced to winter there. Radio contact with Russian Navy icebreakers led to orders for Sverdrup to abandon the search for Hercules and assist in evacuating crew from trapped naval vessels. The following summer, Sverdrup resumed his search but found nothing. Aviator Jan Nagorsky flew the first polar flights that summer, attempting to find the lost expeditions. Then World War I intervened, halting further search efforts. For 20 years, the fate of Rusanov and his crew remained a mystery. In 1934, the survey ship Stalinets found the wooden post on what became Hercules Island. That same year, another discovery provided additional clues. Survey crew member M. Sihanouk explored an islet in the Menina Skerries southwest of Hercules Island. He found artifacts scattered around a makeshift shelter, remnants of a hunting knife, a camera, clothing, and spent shotgun shells. Most significantly, he discovered papers belonging to expedition member Chukchin and a watch belonging to sailor V. Popov. 2 years later, searchers returned to the site and found a notebook in Rusanov's handwriting. The evidence suggested that during 1913, as supplies ran low, Rusanov sent some crew members back towards civilization on foot. Popov and Chukchin were reportedly among those chosen for this journey towards settlements along the Yanis River. In the 1970s, researchers examining old records made another connection. A non-1921 search party looking for 2 men lost from Amundsen's Maud expedition found several old campsites on the Mayoff Peninsula. These sites contained shotgun shells and other items previously attributed to the missing mudmen. But when items found at the Menuiseries were compared, researchers realized they belonged to Rusanov's crew, not Amundsen's. What emerged from these discoveries was both remarkable and tragic. Rusanov had achieved the first part of his ambitious plan. Hercules had rounded the northern tip of Novaya Zemlya and crossed the Kara Sea, reaching the area near the Taimyr Peninsula. They survived at least through 1913, likely longer than anyone expected. Yet, something had gone disastrously wrong. Perhaps their ship was crushed in the ice. Perhaps they became trapped during the harsh winter of 1913. At some point, Rusanov made the decision to split his party. Some members, including Popov and Chukjin, were sent south on foot toward the Yanessa River settlements. They left Marcus behind on Hercules Island, but never reached safety. In 2000, an expedition from Rusanov's hometown found human bones near Mount Min, likely belonging to Captain Kuchin. It was the closest anyone had come to finding the members of the expedition. For rare expedition, the ink had barely dried on the parchment when the clerk sealed it away in the archives of Genoa. The year was 1802, and hidden in the dusty records was a simple note that would intrigue historians for centuries. It spoke of a Catalan named Ioannis Ferner, who had left Morca in 1346 to search for the Criu Ari, the River of Gold. The note was short and chilling. The vessel was never heard from again. This single line, written over 4 centuries after the event, might have been the only record of Yum Ferrer's doomed expedition. But fate preserved another trace of his final journey, captured in gold and silver ink on one of history's most beautiful maps. The message appears in the Catalan atlas created around 1375 by Abram Cresques. Next to an image of a ship flying the Aragonese flag, the inscription reads V in Old Catalan. This means the AXA of Iachme Ferrer departed to go to the River of Gold on St. Lawrence's day, which is the 10th of August in the year 1346. This brief message marks the last known record of a bold expedition from medieval Europe. It captures the moment when Jaume Ferrer sailed beyond the known world, seeking legends that would either make him rich or destroy him. To understand why Ferrer risked everything, we need to know the world he lived in. In 1346, gold was greatly desired by European merchants and explorers. Stories came from Arab traders who crossed the Sahara Desert, telling of rivers rich in gold and kingdoms of unimaginable wealth. These stories were not just made up. The Mali Empire in West Africa controlled vast gold mines that supplied much of the precious metal to Mediterranean markets. Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali, gave away so much gold during his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 that he disrupted the markets in Cairo and Alexandria for 10 years. European merchants knew this gold existed but could not reach it directly. Everything had to pass through dangerous overland routes controlled by Arab and Berber traders who charged high prices. A direct sea route to the goldfields would avoid these middlemen and make whoever found it very wealthy. Yum Ferrer was in a good position to attempt such a journey. Born around 1310 in Morca, he was likely the son of a Genoese immigrant family in the thriving Mediterranean trading hub. Morca in the 1300s was a place where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim merchants worked together. The island's shipyards built fine vessels, and its mapmakers created the most accurate maps of the known world. Ver likely spent his early years commanding merchant ships between Morca and other Mediterranean ports. He would have traded in Sicily, sailed to Flanders, and done business in Genoa. This gave him practical knowledge of navigation, weather, and the challenges of long sea voyages. By 1346, Ferrer had heard enough stories about the River of Gold to plan his expedition. The Genoa archive note reveals that he had learned the river was a collection point for Aram de Paula, which scholars believe meant gold nuggets or gold dust. Local people supposedly gathered this gold from the riverbanks, and the waterway was deep enough for large ships. The river Ferrer sought was almost certainly the Senegal River in West Africa. Medieval Arab geographers had written about this river, calling it the Western Nile or the Nile of Ghana. They said it flowed from the gold-producing regions past trading cities where merchants could trade Mediterranean goods for gold, ivory, and spices. For his expedition, Ferrer chose a ship called an AXA, a type of cargo galley that used both sails and OEs. These ships were common in Mediterranean trade, capable of carrying large loads while remaining easy to steer in coastal waters. However, they were not usually used for long ocean voyages. The Yucca was designed for the Mediterranean, not the Atlantic, with its swells and unpredictable weather. On August 10, 1346, the feast day of St. Lawrence Ferrer's expedition left the port of Palma. The Catalan atlas shows his ship flying the red and yellow stripes of the Aragonese flag as it sailed south into the Atlantic. We do not know how many men went with Ferrare, what supplies they carried, or what goods they hoped to trade for gold. These details disappeared with the expedition. We do know the route Ferrer planned to take. The Catalan atlas shows his ship near Cape Bogador on the coast of what is now Western Sahara. In 1346, this was considered the limit of navigation. European sailors called it the end of the world. Cape Bogador posed major challenges to sailors. Strong northerly winds and currents made it hard for ships to sail south past the Cape, and even harder to sail north on the return trip. The waters were dangerous, filled with hidden reefs and storms. Portuguese sailors would spend years developing the techniques and ship designs needed to safely round Cape Bogador. Finally succeeding in 1434, Ferrer attempted this passage 88 years earlier with a ship that was likely not up to the task. If the Catalan atlas is accurate, he planned to sail far beyond any previous European expedition into waters where no Christian ship had ever gone. The challenges grew more difficult the farther south he sailed. Beyond Cape Bogador lay miles of hostile coastline. The Sahara Desert reached the ocean, offering no fresh water, ports, or chances to get supplies. If his ship was damaged or ran low on provisions, there would be nowhere to turn for help. Even if Ferrer reached the Senegal River, he would still face obstacles. The river mouth was guarded by sandbars that could trap or destroy ships. Local rulers might view his arrival with suspicion, and even if he managed to trade for gold, he would still need to make the return voyage against the winds and currents. Modern analysis suggests Ferrer's expedition was doomed from the start. His ship was likely too large and clumsy, lacking the sails that Portuguese navigators would later develop. His crew probably lacked experience with ocean navigation, having spent their time in the Mediterranean, and his planned route took him through some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. The silence after Ferrer's departure tells us much about his fate. Had the expedition succeeded, word would have spread through Mediterranean trading networks. Morca would have organized more voyages to exploit the new route. Italian city-states would have rushed to compete for access to West African gold. The age of exploration might have begun a century earlier. Instead, there was nothing. No returning ships brought news of success. No gold flowed back to Europe through a new Atlantic route. No maps appeared showing the way to the River of Gold. The expedition vanished. The theories about what happened to Ferrer range from likely to dramatic. His ship might have been wrecked on the reefs around Cape Bogador. He might have been captured by local rulers and held as a slave. His crew might have died of scurvy or other diseases during the long voyage. Or they might have reached the Senegal River only to find that trading for gold was more complicated than they thought. Some historians believe Ferrer's Ukux was simply the wrong type of vessel for the journey. Mediterranean cargo galleys were built for coastal trading, not ocean exploration. They relied on OES, which would have been useless in Atlantic swells. Their shallow bottoms made them vulnerable to the large waves he would have encountered. Others point to the timing. The year 1346 was near the start of the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that made ocean voyages more dangerous. The weather in the Atlantic might have been harsh that year, creating storms that overwhelmed Ferrer's small ship. The mystery deepened in the centuries after Ferrer's disappearance. Portuguese explorers, starting with Gillians in 1434, developed techniques for sailing past Cape Bogador and contacting West Africa. They found no sign of earlier European visitors. No local stories told of a Catalan ship arriving decades before the Portuguese. No European items were found along the Senegal River. Richard Halliburton's Sea Dragon expedition. The shipyard workers in Hong Kong shook their heads and spoke warnings in Cantonese that Richard Halliburton couldn't understand, but their meaning was clear from their faces. The American adventurer watched as Chinese craftsmen worked on his custom-built junk, and even he could see something was wrong. The ship was sitting too high in the water. The top of the ship looked too big compared to the bottom. Naval experts who visited Bailey's shipyard in Kowloon said the vessel was top-heavy and unsafe. That ship will never make it across the Pacific. Captain William McBride of the Merchant Marine told anyone who would listen. She'll roll over in the first big storm. But warnings had never stopped Richard Halliburton. At 38, he was America's most famous adventurer, a man who had spent 2 decades defying common sense and surviving against the odds. He had swam the length of the Panama Canal, climbed Mount Fuji in winter, and flown a biplane to Timbuktu. Critics called him reckless. Fans called him a hero. He had never backed down from a challenge. The Sea Dragon was meant to be his greatest achievement. The Chinese junk would carry him from Hong Kong to San Francisco for the opening of the Golden Gate International Exposition. It would be a publicity sensation, a romantic voyage that mixed ancient maritime tradition with modern adventure. Publishers were planning the book. Lecture tours were being arranged. The plan was to revive Halliburton's fame and secure his financial future. But nothing went as planned. The project had been delayed, cost too much, and had technical problems that should have warned of disaster. The problems began in 1937 when Halliburton decided to sail a Chinese junk across the Pacific. He was inspired by Art Linkletter, a young promoter for the San Francisco World's Fair, who needed a spectacular publicity stunt. What could be better than the famous adventurer arriving in a real Chinese vessel? Halliburton dove into the project. He traveled to Hong Kong and commissioned what he claimed would be the largest junk ever built. The ship would be 75 feet long with traditional Chinese features, but would also have modern engines, radio equipment, and sleeping quarters for Western crew members. The problem started quickly. Halliburton wanted major changes to the traditional junk design, which made the ship less stable. He wanted a large deck house for comfortable accommodations. He wanted extra height to make a dramatic visual impact. He chose heavy wooden masts and rigging that would look good in photographs, but added dangerous weight high above the waterline. Chinese shipwrights at Bailey's shipyard tried to explain that these changes would make the ship unstable, but Halliburton ignored them. He was paying for the construction and he wanted his vision realized. When the workers kept expressing doubts, he hired more supervisors to ensure his specifications were followed. His longtime companion, Paul Mooney, grew worried as construction continued. Mooney had been with Halliburton on expeditions for over a decade and knew when his friend's ambition was affecting his judgment. The Sea Dragon made Mooney nervous. It was an untested vessel designed for publicity rather than safety, planned by a man who had never commanded a ship on a long ocean voyage. "Richard is in love with the idea of this trip," Mooney told friends, "but I'm not sure he understands what we're getting into." Other warnings emerged. Halliburton had difficulty finding experienced crew members. Professional sailors who examined his ship designs refused to sign on because they were concerned about the ship's safety. He had to recruit mostly inexperienced volunteers who were drawn by the adventure rather than the ship. The first attempt to launch the expedition in February 1939 ended in failure. The Sea Dragon left Hong Kong on February 5th, but had to return after only 5 days at sea. The ship had taken on water through poorly sealed joints in the hull. Several crew members became seasick in routine conditions. The ship's handling was so poor that Halliburton struggled to maintain control even in moderate weather. Back in Hong Kong, experts who inspected the damaged ship agreed that the Sea Dragon was flawed and dangerous. The changes Halliburton had insisted on had created a vessel that looked impressive but handled poorly. Naval architects calculated that the ship's center of gravity was so high that it would become unstable in any significant seaway. Captain John Wenlock Welch, a British naval officer stationed in Hong Kong, filed a report condemning the vessel as wholly unsuitable for ocean passage. He warned that the ship would capsize in severe weather and recommended that Halliburton abandon his plans. The man is sailing to his death when Loach Welch told colleagues that ship will not survive a Pacific storm. But Halliburton was too committed to turn back. He had invested his fortune in the expedition. Publishers expected articles about the voyage. The San Francisco Exposition was counting on his arrival. Hundreds of lecture bookings depended on his successful crossing. Halliburton's identity was based on the idea that willpower and courage could overcome any obstacle. He had built his career on achieving things that experts said were impossible. The criticism of his ship only made him more determined to prove the doubters wrong. During the month between his failed attempt and the final departure, Halliburton made minor repairs to the Sea Dragon, but ignored the fundamental design problems. He patched the leaking hull and replaced some rigging, but he did not address the stability issues. On March 4, 1939, the Sea Dragon left Hong Kong for the second and final time. Halliburton had a crew of 14 men, including himself and Paul Mooney. Most were inexperienced sailors drawn by the adventure. A few were competent seamen convinced by Halliburton's reputation. The departure should have been a warning. The Sea Dragon handled poorly even in the harbour. The ship rolled uncomfortably in swells that barely affected other vessels. Several crew members were already seasick before they left the harbour. But Halliburton pressed on, determined to reach San Francisco. For 3 weeks, the Sea Dragon made slow progress across the Pacific. Halliburton sent regular radio messages describing their adventures and maintaining a cheerful tone. But private communications between crew members revealed that the ship was hard to handle, uncomfortable, and taking on water faster than expected. On March 23, 1939, the Sea Dragon encountered the storm that everyone had warned about. A Pacific typhoon struck with winds over 100, mph and waves estimated at 50 ft or higher. The ship's final radio message sent at 7:30 in the evening managed to maintain Halliburton's humor even as disaster approached. Southern-early gales, rain squalls, lee rail underwater, wet bunks, hardtack, bully beef, having wonderful time. Wish you were here instead of me. After that message, the Sea Dragon vanished. No further radio contact was made. No wreckage was ever identified. No survivors were ever found. The loss of Richard Halliburton and his crew was shocking and inevitable. Shocking because Halliburton had seemed indestructible. Inevitable because every expert had predicted this outcome. The warnings had been there from the start. Chinese shipwrights had tried to explain that his changes would make the ship unstable. British naval officers had condemned the ship as unsafe. Professional sailors had refused to join the crew. Even Halliburton's companion had expressed doubts. But Richard Halliburton had built his career on ignoring expert advice. He believed the same qualities that had carried him through previous adventures would see him across the Pacific. He could not accept that his ship might have flaws that willpower could not overcome. In the end, the Pacific Ocean did not care about reputation, courage, or celebrity. The waves that destroyed the Sea Dragon didn't care that Richard Halliburton was famous. The typhoon claimed 14 lives, ignoring experience or ambition. The sea had issued its warnings, but those warnings had been ignored. Lost Colony of Roanoke. On August 18, 1590, the morning on Roanoke Island was calm. John White stood on the Hopewell, watching the shore get closer. After 3 years away, he was returning to his colony. His daughter, Elelana, and granddaughter, Virginia, the first English child born in America. He saw smoke inland, hoping it meant people were still there. But as they rowed ashore, something felt wrong. The beach was empty. No colonists greeted them. Instead, they found fresh Indian footprints. At the settlement, the houses were gone. A rough fort stood in their place. White searched for his people and found CRO carved on a tree. On a forepost, he saw Croatan. 115 colonists had vanished, leaving only this message. To understand this, we must go back to the start to Sir Walter Raleigh's ambitions. By 1587, Raleigh had already failed once at Roanoke. His 1585 colony, led by Ralph Lane, was more about attacking Spanish ships than settling. It ended in violence and evacuation, But Raleigh still believed in English colonies in North America. He planned to send families, not soldiers. They would farm and build a community, not seek quick riches, and they would settle in Chesapeake Bay, not Roanoke Island. Raleigh created a company and offered land to colonists, 500 acres per adult, plus more for children and servants. They would govern themselves and share profits. He chose John White to lead. White was an artist who had been to Roanoke before. His daughter, Elelana, was married to Ananas Dare, who would help govern. In the winter of 1586–87, White recruited 117 colonists, including 17 women and 9 children. They sailed from Portsmouth on May 8, 1587 on 3 ships, including the Lion commanded by Simon Fernandez. The colonists included shoemakers, farmers and tradesmen. By July 22nd, they reached the Outer Banks. They were to briefly stop at Roanoke to check on 15 men left there, then sail to Chesapeake Bay. But Fernandez refused to go further. He said it was too late in the summer to reach Chesapeake Bay, and he needed to return to England before hurricane season. White protested that Roanoke Island was unsuitable. The previous colony had made enemies of the Indians. The island lacked fresh water and good farmland. They couldn't defend against Spanish ships. But Fernandez controlled the ships. White had to accept Roanoke as a temporary home. The colonists repaired the fort, built houses, and cleared land. On August 13th, Elelana gave birth to Virginia, the first English child born in America. But the 15 soldiers were gone, likely killed by Indians. Food was low and fishing and hunting were poor. Relations with the Indians were tense. On August 28th, George Howe was killed. White retaliated, but his men attacked friendly Croatoan Indians by mistake. By late August, the colony needed supplies from England. The colonists asked White to return to England for help, as he had the authority and connections. White didn't want to leave his family, but agreed. They arranged signals. If they left Roanoke, they would carve their destination on a tree. A cross meant distress. On August 27, 1587, White sailed for England, leaving colonists behind. He expected to return in 6 months, but would be gone for 3 years. White's absence was due to the Spanish Armada. Every ship was needed for defense. By the time the threat passed, it was too late to cross the Atlantic. White tried to return in 1588 and 1589, but failed. In March 1590, he secured passage with John Watts's privateering expedition. They agreed to drop White at Roanoke on their way home. The journey took 5 months with stops to attack Spanish ships. On August 15, 1590, they reached the Outer Banks. White waited 3 more days to land. On August 18th, White found the colony abandoned. The houses were gone and the colonists had vanished. His belongings were scattered and ruined. The message Croatan offered hope. Croatan was the island where Mateo's friendly tribe lived. The absence of a cross suggested they weren't in distress. White wanted to sail to Croatan, but couldn't. A storm damaged the ships and the captains feared being wrecked. They abandoned the search and headed for the Caribbean. That was the last search for the lost colony during White's life. He died around 1593, never knowing his family's fate. Over the centuries, search parties have looked for the lost colonists. Some claim survivors lived among Indians, others found artifacts, but no one has found definitive answers. Recent digs have found European artifacts on Hatteras Island, formerly Croatan, and the mainland, suggesting some colonists survived and joined Indian communities. DNA studies have identified possible European ancestry in modern populations. Some Native American families have stories of like-kin ancestors, but the mystery remains. Did the colonists move to Croatan Island? Were they killed by Indians? Did they try to sail back to England and perish? Or did they join local tribes? The questions John White faced in 1590 still haunt investigators. The word Croatoan still beckons, and the resting places of 115 colonists keep their secrets. USS Jeannette expedition in Meridian Hill Park in Washington, D.C. stands a white marble sculpture called Serenity. Most visitors walk past without knowing its story. The serene figure was placed there in 1924 to honor William Schweitzer, a naval officer who died far from home while retrieving the bodies of American explorers from the frozen wasteland of Siberia. Those explorers had died 40 years earlier, trapped in one of the Arctic's most methodical disasters. The sculpture marks more than just one man's sacrifice. It represents a turning point in polar exploration when the romantic dreams of the 19th century crashed against the brutal reality of Arctic ice. The expedition that Schweitzer died trying to memorialize changed everything about how nations approached polar exploration. It ended the era of bold gambles and began the age of scientific preparation. The story begins in July 1879 when the USS Jeannette steamed out of San Francisco Bay. Captain George Washington. Dong stood on the deck of his 142 FT ship, watching the California coast disappear behind him. He was 34 years old, a career Navy officer with Arctic experience who believed he was about to make history. His destination was the North Pole. His route would take him through the Bering Strait and north, across what geographers called the open polar sea. The theory seemed sound. Ocean currents from the Pacific, they believed, created a warm water highway through the ice to an ice-free sea around the North Pole. All Dong had to do was follow the current. 3 men sailed with him, including scientists, officers, and crew members hand-picked for what promised to be a triumphant voyage. They carried enough supplies for 2 years and the latest technology, including an experimental electric lighting system designed by Thomas Edison. What they found instead was ice, endless, crushing, inescapable ice. On September 5, 1879, less than 2 months into their journey, Jeannette became trapped in pack ice near Wrangel Island. The ship was locked in place, unable to move forward or backward. Dong expected the ice to break up with changing weather, freeing his ship to continue north. Instead, the ice carried Jeannette on a slow drift across the Arctic Ocean. For 21 months, the ship became a prison floating on a frozen sea. The crew tried to make the best of their situation. They established routines, conducted scientific observations, and maintained military discipline. But the ice was relentless. It squeezed the ship's wooden hull until the planks groaned and cracked. Water seeped in constantly, requiring round-the-clock pumping. The men took turns descending into the freezing hole to stuff canvas and oakum into the growing leaks. Edison's lighting system failed within weeks. The telephone equipment proved useless. The Arctic darkness that descended in October was broken only by oil lamps and whatever aurora appeared in the sky. During the brief summer months, the sun never set, but the ice never freed them. They drifted northwest, then southwest, sometimes covering only a few miles in an entire month. The psychological strain was as dangerous as the physical hardships. Navigation officer John Dannenhow, who had hidden a history of mental illness to secure his position, began showing signs of severe depression and what appeared to be syphilis-related blindness. Arguments broke out between crew members trapped together in cramped quarters. The ship's meteorologist, Jerome Collins, repeatedly clashed with Dong over authority and duties. Yet, even as his ship was slowly crushed, Dong maintained meticulous records. He documented weather patterns, ocean temperatures, and ice conditions. The expedition discovered and mapped new islands in the Dong archipelago. They proved that the supposed warm Pacific current had no effect north of the Bering Strait, and that the open polar sea was a myth. But these scientific achievements came at a devastating cost. On June 12, 1881, the ice finally won. A massive pressure ridge drove through Jeannette's hull like a knife. The ship began sinking immediately. Dong ordered an evacuation, and his crew dragged supplies, equipment, and 3 small boats across the ice. The next morning, they watched their ship disappear beneath the Arctic Ocean, taking with it any hope of sailing home. What followed was a 1,000 m journey across drifting ice floes and open ocean that would kill 20 of the 33 men. Dong divided his crew among the 3 boats, planning to rendezvous at a Russian settlement in the Lena Delta. A storm separated the boats during the crossing. From the new Siberian islands to the Siberian mainland, only one boat, commanded by engineer George Melville, reached safety with all hands intact. The second boat, carrying 8 men under Lieutenant Charles Chipp, vanished in the storm. No trace of it was ever found. The third boat, with Dong and 12 others, reached the Lena Delta, but landed in an uninhabited area. For 6 weeks, the survivors struggled across the frozen tundra, seeking Russian settlements marked on their maps. One by one they died. First was sailor Hans Eriksson, overcome by frostbite. Then Alexei, their best hunter. Then 6 more men over 9 terrible days in October 1881. Dong kept writing in his journal until the end, documenting the deaths of his comrades, even as he knew his own was approaching. His final entry, dated October 30th, records the deaths of 2 more men and notes that meteorologist Collins was dying. Collins died the next day. So did surgeon James Amler and cook Assel. Dong lasted until November the 6th. When spring came, their bodies were found in a neat line on a small rise, apparently where they had made one final attempt to establish a camp. Dong still clutched his journal. The search for the missing expedition took years and involved multiple nations. Melville, the only boat commander to survive, led search parties back into the Lena Delta during the summers of 1882 and 1883. He found Dong's journal, recovered the bodies, and built a wooden coffin on a hill above the floodplain. A cross marked with the names of the dead stood over the makeshift grave. But retrieving the bodies for burial in America required another expedition. In 1883, Navy Lieutenants Giles Harrow and William Scheiser traveled to Siberia with orders to bring home the remains. Bureaucratic delays, harsh weather, and the immense distance involved kept them in Russia for nearly 2 years. In 1884, they finally transported the bodies by sled, train, and ship from Yakutsk to New York City. The funeral procession through New York drew enormous crowds. Dong and 6 of his men were buried together in Woodland Cemetery. A monument at the Naval Academy in Annapolis honored all the expedition's dead, but the true monument to their sacrifice was built not in stone, but in changed practices. The Jeannette disaster marked the end of romantic polar exploration. The expedition's scientific records recovered from Dong's journal, and the cache he buried before setting out across the ice provided valuable data about Arctic conditions. But more importantly, the systematic way the expedition failed provided lessons about what not to do. Future expeditions would carry more supplies, better equipment, and larger crews. They would establish supply depots and backup plans. Most crucially, they would rely on scientific preparation, rather than geographical theories that had never been tested. The disaster also demonstrated the importance of understanding ocean currents and ice behavior before attempting polar navigation. In an unexpected way, the Jeannette expedition's greatest scientific contribution came from its wreckage. In 1884, debris from the ship appeared on the ice floes off southwest Greenland, proving that a continuous current carried ice from the Siberian side of the Arctic to the North Atlantic. This discovery inspired Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen to deliberately freeze his ship Fram into the ice, using the current to drift across the polar basin. Nansen's expedition succeeded where Dong's had failed, reaching the highest latitude yet attained. The data collected by Jeannette's crew during their icebound drift continues to provide valuable information for modern climate researchers studying Arctic ice behavior and ocean temperatures, their meticulous weather. Observations from the 1880s serve as baseline data for understanding how the Arctic has changed over more than a century. Only 13 of Jeannette's original crew survived to return home. Engineer Melville achieved the rank of Rear Admiral and led other Arctic rescue missions. Navigator Dan Howe continued his naval career until 1887 when he shot himself during a bout of depression. The last survivor, Herbert Leach, worked in a factory until his death in 1935. Emma Dong, the captain's widow, lived until 1940, spending her final decades advocating for better support for families of explorers. Dyatlov Pass Incident. The tent was slashed open from the inside, not by accident, but with 3 precise cuts from a knife, like someone trying to escape. On February 26, 1959, a search party found the tent flapping in the Ural Mountains. Inside were 9 pairs of boots, warm clothes, food, everything the hikers needed for a winter night at 40 degrees below zero. Outside, bare footprints in the snow led away from the tent and vanished into the darkness of Dead Mountain. This turned a normal hiking trip into a puzzling mystery. To understand why 9 experienced climbers ran from their tent in their underwear on February 1, 1959, we need to look at their journey from the beginning. The trip started with confidence. Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student, had organized winter hiking trips for years. His group had 8 students and 1 sports instructor, all good at mountain survival and skiing. They called themselves the snow tourists and liked taking on the toughest routes in the Soviet Union. On January 23, 1959, 10 hikers left Solosk by train for the northern Ural Mountains. They wanted to reach a Taurton mountain, which would give them the highest mountaineering certification. The route went through remote wilderness, across frozen rivers, and up peaks over 3,000 ft high. The group was well prepared. The ATL had planned everything, including supplies and backup plans. Each person had cold weather gear like felt boots, wool clothes, and sleeping bags for extreme temperatures. They had enough food for 16 days and extra emergency supplies. For the first week, everything went as planned. They skied across the frozen land, set up camp each evening, and took photos and wrote in diaries showing they were enjoying themselves despite the cold. On January the 28th, they reached the village of Vizay, their last contact with civilization. From Vizay, they headed north toward Otten, following the Lova River. On January 31st, one hiker, Yuri Yudin, decided to turn back because of sciatica. This decision saved his life. He was the only one who survived. The remaining 9 hikers went on into harder terrain. On February the 1st, the weather got worse with heavy snow and strong winds. They had planned to camp in the forest at the base of the mountains, but somehow they ended up climbing the exposed slopes of what became Dyatlov Pass. This was the first mistake. Instead of staying in the trees below, Dyatlov chose to set up their tent on the open mountain side at $3,000 EFT. It's not clear why. Some think they wanted to get higher for the next day's climb. Others think they got lost in the snow and climbed too high without realizing it. By evening on February the 1st, the 9 hikers had put up their tent on a steep slope where strong winds could reach 60 meters. The temperature was dropping to 25 degrees F, and more snow was falling. Normally, even experienced climbers would go down to the safety of the forest. Instead, Dyatlov's group stayed there for the night. The last photo from their camera shows the hikers digging a platform for their tent in the snow as it got dark. They looked calm and organized. Inside the tent, they made dinner, wrote in their diaries, and got their equipment ready for the next day. They didn't seem scared, and something happened that changed everything. During the night, all 9 hikers left the tent at the same time, cutting their way out instead of using the entrance. They left behind their boots, warm clothes, and survival equipment. In temperatures that could kill quickly, they walked barefoot or in socks across the snow to the tree line below. The evidence found by search parties shows they were getting more and more desperate. The first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Kravenchenko, were found near a fire made from branches torn from a cedar tree. Both men were almost naked and showed signs of hypothermia. crevice had burned his hands trying to keep the fire going and had bitten off part of his finger, a sign of frostbite. 3 more bodies were found between the fire and the tent, as if they had tried to return but couldn't make it. Igor Datlov was found face down in the snow wearing his underwear and 1 sock. Zenida Kolmogora and Rustam Sloin were nearby, also not dressed warmly enough. All 3 had died from hypothermia. The remaining 4 hikers had built a snow cave in a ravine about 250 ft from the fire, but it became their tomb. When their bodies were found in May, investigators found injuries that couldn't be explained by the cold. Nikolai Thibault Brinol had a fractured skull. Seon Zolitario and Ludmila Dubinina had broken ribs and internal injuries. Dubinina was missing her tongue and eyes. These 4 bodies seemed to have been crushed by something powerful like a truck. But there were no vehicles on the mountain, no explosion, and no signs of animals or humans attacking. Soviet investigators said the hikers had died from a compelling natural force, but couldn't say what it was. For 60 years, people have suggested many theories to explain what happened on Dyatlov Pass. Some said they were killed by an avalanche, but the slope wasn't steep enough. Others said it was military weapons testing, but there was no evidence. Radioactive contamination on some clothing led to talk of nuclear accidents, but it was from other sources. More strange theories came up as the case became famous. Some said the local many people attacked them, but there was no evidence. Others suggested encounters with Yeti or attacks by infrasound weapons that cause panic. But none of these theories explained everything.
Amvi joined a disappearance.
Captain Gerald Douglas looked through his binoculars and rubbed his eyes. It was November the 10th, 1955, and his ship, the Tuvalu, was sailing through calm waters south of Fiji. His lookout spotted something odd on the horizon. Through the morning haze, Douglas could see a ship leaning to one side, so low in the water that its deck was almost underwater. As the Tuvalu got closer, Douglas felt a chill. The ship was drifting with no one on board. Its structure was damaged and there was no sign of life. The ship was the MV Joyita, and it was supposed to be carrying 25 people. Instead, Douglas saw an empty ghost ship that had been drifting for 5 weeks across hundreds of miles of ocean. The radio was set to the distress frequency, but no distress call had ever been sent. Lifeboats and life rafts were gone, but the ship was still afloat. The cargo holds were partly flooded, but the ship was built to be almost unsinkable. Where were the 25 people who had simply disappeared? To understand this, we need to go back to October 3rd, 1955, when the Hoyita was about to leave Apia Harbor in Samoa. The ship was a 69 FT yacht that had been changed to carry cargo and passengers between the Pacific Islands. Built in 1931, it had been a patrol boat during World War II before being sold to people who used it for trading in the South Pacific. Captain Thomas Dusty Miller was running late loading cargo and passengers. The ship's engine clutch had broken the day before, so he had to delay the trip. By the morning of October 3rd, Miller decided to sail with only one engine instead of waiting for repairs. This was against safety rules, but Miller was under pressure to make money and couldn't wait any longer. The passenger list was a mix of people from the Pacific Islands. Dr. Alfred Parsons was going to do surgery on a patient in the Tokala Islands. Roger Pless, a government official, was returning to his job. 2 children were traveling with their adoptive parents. The crew included sailors from Samoa, Tokelau, and Kiribati, most of whom were experienced in navigating between islands. The trip to the Tokala Islands was supposed to take between 41 and 48 hours, covering 270 meters. Miller had done this trip many times and didn't expect any problems, even with one engine. The weather forecast was normal, and the sea was calm when the Hoyita left Samoa's harbor at 5 odd in the morning. For the first day, everything went as planned. The single engine pushed the Joyita steadily northeast. The passengers settled in and the crew kept their watches. But a pipe in the ship's cooling system was already starting to break down, unknown to anyone. During the second night at sea, somewhere between 50 and 100 men from the Tukala Islands, the pipe finally broke. Sea water flooded into the engine room faster than the ship's pumps could remove it. The bilgejag pumps were also clogged and not working. As water rose, the crew would have realized they were in serious trouble. Captain Miller had to make some difficult decisions in the dark. The ship was taking on water but was still stable because of its cork-lined hull and cargo of empty oil drums. His radio could only reach Tuamid because of bad wiring, so he couldn't call for help.
Land was still hours away, and the engine was struggling.
What happened next is one of the Pacific's biggest mysteries. When search teams found the Hoyita 5 weeks later, all 25 people were gone. The ship's 3 life rafts were missing along with the navigation equipment, logbooks, and guns. Most of the cargo was gone, including medical supplies and food. The scene was strange and puzzling. Electric clocks had stopped at 10:25, suggesting something happened at night when the ship's generator failed. The starboard engine was covered with mattresses, probably to protect it from water. A makeshift pump had been set up between the engines, but was never connected. On deck, searchers found a doctor's bag with a stethoscope, a scalpel, and 4 blood-stained bandages. The bandages suggested someone had been hurt, but it wasn't clear what happened. Captain Miller's personal things were missing, along with anything that might explain why he and his passengers had left a ship that was still afloat. An investigation in Apia struggled to make sense of the evidence. Investigators decided the Hoyita had been in bad shape when it left with broken pipes, bad electrical systems, and poor safety equipment. Captain Miller had broken rules by sailing with one engine and letting his passenger license expire. But this didn't explain why experienced sailors would abandon a ship that was still floating. The most confusing finding was that the Hoyita was almost unsinkable, even with the flooding. The ship's cork-lined hull provided buoyancy, and the empty fuel drums added more. An experienced captain like Miller would have known this, making investigators wonder why he would order an abandonment. Several theories tried to explain the disappearance. Some said Captain Miller had been killed, leaving the passengers and crew to panic. The bloody bandages supported this, but nobody was found. Others pointed to a fight between Miller and his first mate, Chuck Simpson, with both men dead or injured. More dramatic theories were in the news. Japanese fishing boats were in the area, leading to talk that the Hoyita had seen something that required killing witnesses. The discovery of knives stamped "Made in Japan" seemed to support this, but they were old and probably left from the ship's previous use as a fishing vessel. Cold War paranoia led to talk that a Soviet submarine had captured the passengers and crew. Early reports that the Hoyita had been in a collision led to theories about modern pirates who had attacked the ship, but none of these explained the evidence. The most likely explanation came from author Robin Morm, who spent years investigating the case. Morm said the disaster started with the pipe breaking, and then crew members demanded Miller turn back to Samoa. This led to a mutiny in which Miller was hurt, which explains the bloody bandages. First mate Simpson then took control and made the decision to abandon the ship, possibly because they thought they saw an island or reef nearby. In bad weather, the life rafts would have been swept away, carrying all 25 people to their deaths. This would explain why the navigation equipment and supplies were missing. Simpson would have taken everything. But even this theory has problems. No experienced sailor would choose small rafts over a floating ship. And if they were going to an island, why was no trace of them ever found? The search for the missing people began on October 6th, when the ship didn't arrive. Planes searched a large area of ocean without finding anything. The search was called off after 6 days. When Captain Douglas found the drifting ship 5 weeks later, it created a new mystery. The ship was towed to Sua, Fiji, where investigators found it floated normally once the water was pumped out. This raised new questions about why anyone would abandon such a ship. The bloodstained bandages continued to puzzle investigators. The inquiry made no mention of this medical evidence in its final report. The bandages showed someone had been hurt badly enough to need treatment, but not necessarily fatally. SS Werar. The signal lamp flashed one last time across the morning waters. Waratah Durban to Cape Town blinked the message from the passenger steamship to the cargo vessel Clan McIntyre. It was 6 a.m. on July 27, 1909, and Captain Bruce of the Clan McIntyre replied with his own signal. The two ships had been travelling together since 4 a.m. when Warar appeared behind the smaller vessel. Now the passenger liner was pulling ahead, her twin screws churning white foam as she gained speed. Captain Bruce watched the 465 FT ship disappear over the horizon. At 9:30 a.m. he was the last person to communicate with the SS War and her 211 passengers and crew, to understand how this routine exchange became the last message from one of maritime history's greatest mysteries. We must go back to the ship's creation and the concerns surrounding her from the very start. The Blue Anchor Line had commissioned Waratah in 1907 as an improved version of their successful steamship, Geelong, built by Barclay Curle and Company in Glasgow. She was designed to carry passengers and cargo between London and Australia. At 9,339 tons, she represented the latest in Edwardian maritime technology. Her cargo holds could be converted into dormitories for immigrants on the outward voyage. While on the return journey, she would typically be loaded with Australian wool, frozen meat, and mineral concentrates. However, from her maiden voyage in November 1908, Waratah began to attract troubling reports about her stability. Captain Josiah Ilbery, a veteran seaman with 30 years of experience, noticed that the ship handled differently from his former command, the Geelong. Passengers complained that Waratah rolled excessively in moderate seas and was slow to right herself after leaning into a swell. More seriously, she had a tendency to list to one side for hours, even in calm conditions. Professor William Bragg, a physicist travelling on the maiden voyage, became convinced that the ship's centre of gravity was too close to her centre of buoyancy. When Waratah rolled, she would reach a point of equilibrium and remain there until wind or waves pushed her upright. This was a clear sign of potential instability which could be fatal in severe weather. Despite these concerns, Waratah passed all inspections and received Lloyd's of London's highest rating of Kells plus 100. A1, the builders provided evidence that she was properly designed and built, but the conflicting reports from passengers and crew created an atmosphere of unease that would shadow her brief career. By July 1909, Waratah was on her second voyage to Australia. She carried 193 passengers and a crew of 119 along with a varied cargo. The outward journey went smoothly, though several passengers noted the ship's unsettling rolling motion. In Adelaide, she loaded nearly 1,000 tons of lead or concentrate, a cargo that would later become significant in theories surrounding her disappearance. One passenger who became increasingly nervous about the ship was Claude Sawyer, a business director and experienced traveller. During the voyage from Adelaide to Durban, Sawyer claimed to have disturbing dreams involving a man with a bloody sword warning him of danger. Whether prompted by these dreams or genuine concerns about Warar's stability, Sawyer chose to disembark in Durban rather than continue to Cape Town. He later testified that he believed the ship was top-heavy and unsafe, sending a telegram to his wife stating, "Booked Cape Town. Thought Waratah, top-heavy, landed Durban." His decision would make him the most famous survivor of a disaster yet to come. On the evening of July 26th, Waratah departed Durban for the last time. Captain Ilbery was on board with 211 souls, including the mixed cargo of Leor loaded in Adelaide. The weather was fair as the ship headed south along Natal's coast on a journey to Cape Town 400 metres away. It should have been a routine voyage of less than 2 days. The next morning brought the encounter with Clan McIntyre, the last confirmed sighting of Wara. Captain Bruce later recalled that both ships were making good speed in reasonable weather. The signal exchange was routine, with nothing indicating problems aboard the passenger liner. However, conditions began to deteriorate rapidly after that final message. The The weather along the South African coast is known for sudden changes, and July 27th marked the start of a severe storm. By evening, winds were reaching gale force and massive swells were building along the continental shelf, where warm and cold ocean currents converge. Several ships reported unusual sightings that evening. The steamship Harlow observed dense smoke on the horizon, raising concerns about a vessel on fire. As darkness fell, crew members saw lights that suddenly vanished after 2 flashes. Most notably, a military observer on shore reported seeing a steamship matching Waratah's description struggle against the heavy seas before being overwhelmed by a massive wave. But after that night, there was silence. Waratah was expected in Cape Town on July 29th, but she never arrived. When other ships that left Durban after her reached port safely, alarms set in. Search vessels were dispatched without finding any trace of the missing liner. The Royal Navy sent cruisers to scour the South African coast, but they encountered violent waves, damaging one warship and forcing it to return for repairs. For months, hope remained that Waratah might still be adrift somewhere in the South Atlantic. The steamship Waikato had survived over 100 days of drift after losing its propeller in 1899, and Waratah carried enough provisions for a year. Unfortunately, without radio equipment, she could not call for help beyond visual range. Extensive searches covered thousands of square miles without finding confirmed wreckage or survivors. The official inquiry held in London in 1910 struggled to explain the disappearance, with witnesses offering contradictory accounts about war's stability. Some passengers felt she was unsafe, while others described her as seaworthy. The shipbuilders presented data showing proper design, but experts couldn't dismiss the worrying reports from her brief career. The most likely explanation came from the combination of factors on July 27th. Waratah's questionable stability, the sudden storm, and the treacherous waters of South Africa could have overwhelmed even a well-constructed ship. The lee door in her holds may have shifted during rough seas affecting stability, or she might have encountered freak waves common in the area that can reach 60 ft or more. Whatever happened occurred swiftly. Despite carrying lifeboats and rafts for 921 people, no survivors were found, no bodies washed ashore, and no wreckage was ever confirmed. The absence of debris suggests Waratah sank quickly in deep water, possibly trapping any buoyant materials beneath her overturned hull. The disappearance severely impacted the Blue Anchor Line. Public confidence fell, ticket sales plummeted, and financial losses led to the company's bankruptcy within a year. The disaster highlighted ongoing maritime safety challenges. At a time when many ships lacked radio equipment and weather forecasting was basic, over the decades, numerous expeditions have sought Waratah's wreck. Modern technology like sonar and remote-operated vehicles has been used, but her final resting place remains unknown. The South African continental shelf drops into deep ocean trenches where a wreck might lie undisturbed for centuries. Some believe she may have drifted southward toward Antarctica before sinking. The mystery has inspired countless theories, ranging from plausible to fantastical. Some focus on cargo shift or structural failure. Others suggest whirlpools or explosions in her coal bunkers. The most credible explanations involve the combination of marginal stability and extreme weather conditions that characterized that night in July 1909. Polaris expedition leadership. The barometer was dropping fast. Captain Sidney Buddington felt a knot in his stomach as he watched the needle fall. It was November 7th, 1871, and the USS Polaris was stuck in Arctic ice at Thank God Harbor. Inside the ship, Charles Francis Hall was dying.
Outside, a blizzard was coming that would last for days.
The expedition to plant the American flag at the North Pole was falling apart with accusations of murder in the air. Buddington knew they would be bringing home a dead man instead of a hero, but there had been warning signs from the start. Before the Polaris even left New York, people questioned whether Hall could lead a naval expedition. He was a former engraver from Cincinnati with no military training or experience leading large groups. He had previously traveled solo in the Arctic, living with Inuit families and learning their survival skills. Leading a ship with 25 crew members was a completely different challenge. Personality conflicts also arose during the planning phase. Hall insisted on bringing German scientist Emil Bessels as the expedition's chief medical officer and naturalist. Bessels was brilliant, but openly scorned Hall's lack of formal education and unconventional approach to exploration. Before departure, the two men barely spoke to each other. Naval officers also questioned Hall's choices. Captain Buddington, who would serve as sailing master, had Arctic experience but was known for his drinking and pessimism. He called the North Pole quest a damned fool's errand and had no faith in Hall's leadership. Assistant navigator George Tyson warned that the expedition was heading for disaster. The problems became clear soon after departure on June 29, 1871. As Polaris sailed north through Davis Strait toward Greenland, tensions erupted into open conflict. Hall found himself commanding men who questioned his orders and criticized his decisions. Vessels formed a German-speaking group speaking their language when Hall was around. The ship was splitting into hostile groups before even reaching the Arctic. Hall pressed forward, driven by his desire to reach the North Pole. The expedition made remarkable progress, sailing further north than any previous ship, reaching a new record of 82 to 89 minutes latitude. This success only increased tensions. Hall wanted to push further north, while Buddington and Bessels insisted on finding winter quarters before being trapped by ice. The turning point came on October 24, 1871. Hall had just returned from a 2E sledging expedition to scout routes to the pole. He was tired but optimistic, believing he'd found a way to reach 90° north in the spring. At sunset, he boarded Polaris and asked for a cup of coffee. Minutes after drinking the coffee, Hall collapsed in agony. He vomited and complained of burning sensations throughout his body. His hands and feet went numb, and he experienced partial paralysis. Dr. Bessels diagnosed apoplexy, a stroke brought on by the demands of Arctic exploration. But Hall had a different explanation. "The little German dancing master is trying to poison me," Hall gasped. He accused Bessels of poisoning his coffee and demanded that others taste his food before he would eat. The accusation stunned everyone. A murder attempt in the Arctic wilderness seemed impossible. Bessels insisted on treating Hall despite the captain's protests. He administered what he claimed were standard medications for stroke symptoms. But Hall's condition worsened. He suffered periods of delirium, ranting about conspiracies and betrayal, and accused specific crew members of plotting against him. On October 29th, Hall's condition suddenly improved. He banned Vessels from his cabin and refused all treatment from the German doctor. For nearly a week, he seemed to be recovering, walking on deck and discussing plans for the spring. Crew members hoped their captain would survive. Then Hall made a fatal mistake. On November 4th, he allowed Vessels to resume medical treatment. The doctor brought medications and administered what he claimed were remedies to speed recovery. Within hours, Hall's condition collapsed again, suffering severe pain, renewed paralysis, and periods of unconsciousness. George Tyson watched with growing suspicion, noting that Hall's improvement had been dramatic when Bessels was banned from treating him. But once the doctor resumed care, Hall's symptoms returned. On the evening of November 8th, Hall called Tyson to his bedside. He gave final instructions for the expedition. If anything happened to him, Tyson should take command from Bington and continue toward the North Pole. Hall believed the American flag could still be planted at 90° north if the crew remained unified. A few hours later, Charles Francis Hall was dead. The death fractured the expedition's remaining cohesion. Buddington took command, but abandoned plans to continue north, focusing only on surviving the winter and returning home. The scientific work continued under Vessels, but the expedition's original purpose had died with Hall. What followed was a disaster, vindicating every warning about the expedition's poor organization. When Polaris broke free from the ice the following summer, Buddington ran the ship ground on an iceberg. 19 crew members, including the Inuit guides and their families, along with George Tyson, became stranded on an ice floe. For 6 months, the castaways drifted on their shrinking ice floe through 1/800 milliliters of Arctic Ocean. They survived because the Inuit members knew how to hunt seals and build shelters. When rescued off the coast of Labrador, they had been reduced to eating their leather boots and strips of seal skin. The remaining crew members abandoned Polaris and built shelters on the Greenland coast, surviving the winter with help from local Inuit hunters. A rescue ship found them the following summer, completing one of the most disastrous polar expeditions in American history. The Navy Board of Inquiry investigating Hall's death faced an impossible task. The captain's body was buried in the Arctic permafrost, making an autopsy impossible. Witness testimony was contradictory, and the board concluded that Hall had died from natural causes, likely a stroke brought on by the stresses of Arctic command. But questions persisted for nearly a century. In 1968, Arctic historian Chanty Loomis organized an expedition to exhume Hall's body. The permafrost had preserved the corpse, allowing forensic analysis impossible. In 1871, hair and fingernail samples showed massive doses of arsenic in Hall's system during the final 2 weeks of his life. Someone had systematically poisoned the expedition commander, as Hall had claimed while dying. The evidence pointed to Emil Bessels as the most likely suspect. As the doctor, he had access to arsenic and the knowledge to administer it in doses that would simulate apoplexy. He was the only person with consistent access to Hall when he was being poisoned. The motive remained unclear, but the murder may have stemmed from the bitter conflicts that plagued the expedition. Bessels may have believed Hall's leadership endangered the crew, or the killing may have resulted from a romantic rivalry involving a woman they both courted, USS Cyclops. The radio operator in Washington checked his log one more time. "Weather fair, all well," the message read. It had come from USS Cyclops at 10:30 a.m. on March 4, 1918, as the ship left Barbados for Baltimore. The operator filed the message. Not knowing these were the last words from 306 American sailors and passengers about to vanish in the Bermuda Triangle. Lieutenant Commander George Washington Wallali seemed confident that morning. The 54-year-old captain had commanded Cyclops for 3 years. At 542 ft long and nearly 20,000 tons, it was one of the Navy's largest cargo ships designed to haul coal. But this trip was different. Instead of coal, its holds were packed with 11,000 tons of manganese ore, essential for steel production during World War I. The mission began 2 months earlier when the Navy ordered Cyclops to Brazil to collect the cargo. America needed manganese for weapons, and Brazilian mines were the only source outside German control. On January 9, 1918, the ship left Baltimore for Rio de Janeiro, carrying a civilian crew and some Navy personnel. The trip south went normally with scheduled stops in the Caribbean, but problems started during loading in Rio. Manganese ore was denser than coal. Each ton took up less space, creating concentrated weight that stressed the ship's hull. Supervisors worried about the loading, but pressure to get the material back to America outweighed safety. Rumors also circulated about Captain Wallali, born Johann Georg Wickmann in Germany. With Andre's diary, Steinberg's photographs and their scientific instruments perfectly preserved by the Arctic cold, the discovery sparked intense debate about what killed them. Some blamed cyanosis from undercooked bear meat. Others suggested carbon monoxide poisoning from their camp stove or vitamin A poisoning from seal liver. Recent research suggests they may have been attacked by polar bears, with Andre possibly choosing to end his life with morphine rather than face death alone on the ice. What remains clear is that Andre's final diary entry captures both the expedition's tragedy and the human
spirit that drove these men into the Arctic.
Even facing certain death, Andre took comfort in simple things. Solid ground beneath his feet, the silence after months of grinding ice, the hope that better weather might still allow them to move forward. Expeditions, hundreds of explorers, all lost forever.
These weren't just tragic accidents.
They were the price of human curiosity. Every generation has those willing to risk everything to see what lies beyond the horizon. Some return as heroes, others become cautionary tales. But here's what matters. They tried. They pushed forward when others stayed safe. They chose the unknown over comfort, discovery over